2 days after I gave birth to twins, my mother-in-law showed up with my husband's mistress and a set of divorce papers. "Take $25 million and sign it," she demanded. "I only want the kids." I signed the papers and disappeared that very night. By morning, she realized that something had gone terribly wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who underestimated your worth. My name is Juliet. I am 33 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant in Chicago. The sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor were the only things tethering me to reality. I was lying in a bed inside an exclusive VIP maternity ward recovering from a grueling emergency cesarean section. My body felt as though it had been split in two. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony radiating through my abdomen. Despite the physical trauma, the emotional atmosphere in the room was entirely devoid of warmth. I had given birth to beautiful, healthy twins just 48 hours prior. They were sleeping peacefully in the twin bassinets beside my bed, perfectly swaddled and entirely unaware of the storm that was about to break inside that hospital room. The heavy wooden door to my private suite swung open without so much as a warning knock. The sudden noise made me flinch, gripping the edge of the thin hospital blanket. Constance, my mother-in-law, marched into the room like a general inspecting a conquered territory. She was draped in a ridiculously lavish designer coat, her posture rigid and her face sculpted into a mask of pure disdain. She did not come alone. Trailing closely behind her was my husband, Harrison. He was 35 years old, but perpetually carried himself like a scolded child whenever his mother was present. Clinging to his arm with an air of arrogant possession was Kylie. Kylie was 24 years old, and she was Harrison's mistress. Constance did not ask how I was feeling. She did not glance at the bassinets to check on her newborn grandchildren. She walked straight to the side of my bed and tossed a thick, heavy stack of legal documents directly onto my lap. The papers landed with a heavy thud against my wounded abdomen, but I did not let out a sound. I simply stared at the woman who had made my life a living nightmare for the past 4 years. "Harrison is filing for immediate divorce," Constance announced. Her voice was cold and clinical, echoing off the stark white walls of the hospital room. She reached into her designer handbag and produced a crisp certified cashier's check. She slid it onto the plastic tray table hovering over my bed. The number printed on the check was $25 million. "Take the money, sign full custody of the twins over to Harrison and Kylie, and walk away," Constance demanded. She leaned closer, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the bed rail. "You were only ever an incubator for the family bloodline anyway. We have no further use for you, Juliet." I looked past Constance and locked eyes with Harrison. The man I had married, the man who had promised to stand by me through sickness and health, refused to meet my gaze. He stared at the linoleum floor, shifting his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "Harrison," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level, "is this really how you want to do this?" He finally looked up, and instead of showing an ounce of remorse, he immediately went on the defensive. "Do not make this difficult, Juliet," he snapped, stepping out from behind his mother. "You know you have always been too obsessed with your ledgers and your spreadsheets to be a real mother. Kylie is ready to step in and give these children the attention they deserve. It is exactly like when you skipped our anniversary dinner for that federal audit last year. You lack maternal instinct, and my children need a mother who will actually be present." His words were designed to hurt, to gaslight me into believing that my dedication to my career was a fundamental character flaw. It was a familiar tactic. For years, Harrison had used my demanding profession as a forensic accountant to justify his own shortcomings. Whenever he failed to show up for me, he blamed my work schedule. Whenever he sought attention from other women, he claimed I was too cold and analytical to understand his emotional needs. I had known about Kylie for nearly a year. I had tracked the mysterious credit card charges, the weekend hotel bookings, and the expensive jewelry purchases hidden within his bank statements. My profession taught me that numbers never lie, even when husbands do. I had spent the last 9 months of my high-risk pregnancy silently preparing for this exact moment. Kylie stepped forward, a smug and victorious smile playing on her lips. She reached out and callously stroked one of the soft baby blankets draped over the edge of the bassinet. "They are going to have a wonderful life with us, Juliet," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Harrison and I have already picked out the perfect nursery decor for the main house. You can take your little check and go back to your boring numbers." The sheer audacity of the scene might have broken another woman. I had just undergone major surgery. I was bleeding, exhausted, and vulnerable. My husband was standing in front of me with his mistress, while his mother tried to purchase my flesh and blood like commodities at a corporate acquisition. But I did not cry. I did not scream or beg or throw the papers back in their faces. I felt an eerie, overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. This was the moment I had anticipated. This was the final confirmation that these people were exactly who the financial records proved them to be: ruthless, greedy, and utterly devoid of humanity. I looked at the documents resting on my lap. They were extensive, outlining a complete surrender of parental rights, a gag order, and a clean break divorce settlement. I slowly raised my eyes to meet Constance's expectant gaze. "May I borrow your pen?" I asked pleasantly. Constance looked momentarily taken aback by my lack of resistance, but quickly recovered her haughty demeanor. She pulled a heavy platinum pen from her pocket and handed it to me with a triumphant smirk. I clicked the pen open and began to sign my name on the dotted lines. I signed every page, every initial box, and every custody surrender form without a single moment of hesitation. The scratch of the platinum pen against the thick paper was the only sound in the room. When I reached the final page, I capped the pen and handed it back to her. Then I picked up the certified cashier's check for $25 million, folded it neatly in half, and tucked it into the pocket of my hospital robe. I looked up at the three of them and smiled. It was not a smile of defeat. It was a hollow, chilling smile that caused Harrison to take a small step backward. "Excellent," Constance said, snatching the documents from my lap and securing them in her bag. That was much easier than I anticipated. She turned to Harrison and Kylie. "Go celebrate, you two. We will return in the morning upon her discharge to pick up the children." Constance gave me one final look of utter disgust before sweeping out of the room, her expensive coat trailing behind her. Harrison and Kylie followed without looking back, leaving me completely alone in the quiet hospital suite. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor and the soft breathing of my newborn babies. The second I was certain they were gone, my demeanor shifted entirely. I threw back the hospital blankets, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in my abdomen. I reached over and carefully unplugged my intravenous line, pressing a piece of gauze to my hand to stop the bleeding. I moved with precision and purpose, ignoring the physical limitations of my recovering body. I picked up my cell phone from the bedside table and dialed a secure number. The line rang only once before a deep voice answered. "Execute Protocol 0. I said, my voice firm and authoritative. "We leave through the service elevator in exactly 5 minutes. Have the transport ready at the loading dock." "Understood," came the swift reply. I carefully strapped the babies into the carriers, ensuring they were warm and secure. The hallway outside my door was quiet as the night shift nurses were busy attending to rounds on the opposite end of the ward. I slipped out of the room, moving silently down the corridor toward the designated service elevator. My private security detail, a team I had hired months ago using untraceable funds, was waiting exactly where they promised. A tall man in a dark suit nodded to me, taking the heavy duffel bag from my shoulder while I held my children close to my chest. We descended to the basement-level loading dock without encountering a single soul. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped into the waiting armored vehicle. As the truck pulled away from the hospital, navigating the quiet city streets, I held my babies tight. By the time the sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting a golden glow across the city, Juliet, the twins, and the $25 million had completely vanished into thin air. Constance, Harrison, and Kylie were about to wake up to a reality where the rules of their wealthy, untouchable world had been entirely rewritten. The morning sun had barely crested the Chicago skyline when Constance strode through the sliding glass doors of the hospital. She moved with the untouchable entitlement of a woman who believed her wealth could bend reality to her will. She wore a tailored ivory coat that swept the polished floors, her chin raised high, ignoring the security guards and receptionists who turned to watch her grand arrival. Harrison walked close behind her, looking slightly hungover, but entirely compliant, wearing a casual designer sweater as if he were attending a Sunday brunch rather than collecting his newborn children. Clinging tightly to his arm was Kylie. She had spent hours preparing for this exact moment. She wore a pristine white summer dress, her hair blown out into loose, flawless waves. She carried a ridiculously expensive woven diaper bag over her shoulder, ready to play the role of the glowing new mother. Trailing the trio was a bizarre, carefully curated entourage. 2 private nannies in matching gray uniforms pushed top-of-the-line luxury bassinets. A professional photographer walked backward in front of them, snapping candid shots of Harrison and Kylie smiling lovingly at each other. Constance had orchestrated the entire spectacle to ensure their high society circle saw a seamless, beautiful transition of power. They were not a family arriving to pick up babies. They were a corporate acquisition team arriving to collect their assets. They reached the VIP maternity wing, and Constance did not bother to pause or knock at the door of Juliet's recovery suite. She pushed the heavy wooden door open with a triumphant smirk, fully expecting to find a defeated weeping woman ready to hand over the family bloodline. Instead, she stepped into absolute silence. The room was immaculately clean. The hospital bed was stripped of its linens, exposing the sterile mattress underneath. The twin bassinets that had sat by the window just hours ago were gone. The heart monitors and intravenous stands were powered down, their screens blank and dark. There were no bags, no flowers, no discarded newborn clothes. It looked as though no one had ever occupied the space. Constance froze, her triumphant smile faltering. Harrison bumped into her back, letting out an annoyed sigh before peering over her shoulder. Kylie lowered her sunglasses, her manufactured smile dropping into a look of profound confusion. "Where is she?" Constance demanded, her voice echoing sharply against the bare walls. She spun around and marched back into the hallway, zeroing in on the nurse's station. A charge nurse looked up from her charts, clearly startled by the aggressive approach of the wealthy matriarch. "I demand to know where the patient in room 412 has been moved," Constance snapped, slamming her hand flat onto the high counter. "Bring me those babies immediately. I have the legal paperwork transferring full custody to my son." The charge nurse blinked, typing Juliet's name into the hospital registry system. She looked back up, her expression a mix of bewilderment and professional caution. "Ma'am, the patient in room 412 discharged herself against medical advice late last night. She took both infants and left the premises. She is no longer under our care." Constance's face drained of color before flushing with absolute fury. She slammed her designer handbag onto the counter. "You let her walk out of here with my grandchildren. Lock down this entire building right now. I am calling the police chief. She has kidnapped the heirs to my family." Harrison paced the hallway in a panic, running his hands through his hair. Kylie crossed her arms, whining to Harrison about how she had paid the photographer for a full hour and her makeup was going to waste. The nannies stood awkwardly by the elevator, holding the empty luxury carriers. Constance whipped out her phone and began dialing the police, screaming at the hospital staff to freeze all security footage. Before the call could connect, the heavy double doors of the maternity ward flew open. A man in a dark, expensive suit sprinted down the hallway. It was David, the family's high-priced corporate lawyer. He was completely out of breath, his tie loosened and sweat shining on his forehead. He looked entirely unhinged, a stark contrast to his usual arrogant composure. David lunged forward and physically snatched the phone out of Constance's hand just as the emergency dispatcher answered. He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. "Have you completely lost your mind?" David hissed, grabbing Constance by the elbow and dragging her back into the empty hospital suite. He kicked the door shut, locking the photographer, the nannies, and the nurses out in the hallway. Only Harrison and Kylie were left inside with them. "What are you doing?" Constance yelled, trying to yank her arm free. Call the authorities. That useless accountant stole my grandchildren and my $25 million. You are not calling anyone, David shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He threw his leather briefcase onto the stripped hospital bed and turned to glare at the three of them. You absolute fools! You went behind my back and drafted a legal contract without my oversight. You thought you could just walk into a hospital and buy human beings. I bought her out. Constance corrected, her voice dripping with venom. She signed the custody transfer. I have her signature on paper. She took the money. You committed human trafficking! David roared, finally silencing her. You cannot legally buy custody of children in the United States of America. The moment you handed her a cashier's check in exchange for human lives, that contract became void. It is illegal. It is trafficking. If you call the police, they will not arrest Juliet. They will arrest you. Harrison stumbled back against the window, his face going completely white. What are you talking about? She signed the papers. Harrison stammered. David laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the empty room. She did not just take your money, Harrison. Juliet has been playing you all for absolute fools. I just got off the phone with a family court judge. Juliet filed a sealed domestic abuse petition 3 weeks ago. She has meticulously documented every instance of your emotional abuse, your financial manipulation, and your complete abandonment during a high-risk pregnancy. At midnight last night, a judge granted her an emergency order of protection and temporary sole legal custody of those twins. She did not kidnap anyone. She took her children and left totally protected by federal law. Harrison's shock quickly morphed into the petulant rage of a man who had never been told no. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking as he dialed Juliet's number. It went straight to voicemail. He gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles turning white, and began recording a furious, unhinged message. You are pulling the same stunt you did when you froze my credit cards last Thanksgiving, just because I took Kylie to Paris. Harrison yelled into the phone, completely exposing his own cowardice. You think you can just run away with my kids? You are nothing without my family name. Call me back right now, or I swear I will make your life a living hell. He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket, pacing the length of the room like a petulant toddler who had just been denied a toy. The voicemail did not make him look powerful. It merely confirmed what Juliet had known for nearly a year. She had known about the affair. She had known about the secret trips to Paris. She had deliberately frozen his accounts on Thanksgiving to test her own power, and Harrison had been too stupid to see the larger trap she was setting. Constance, refusing to accept defeat, smoothed the lapels of her coat and stood tall. The initial shock wore off, replaced by her usual sneering arrogance. She let out a dry, dismissive laugh that made David stare at her in disbelief. You are all panicking over nothing, Constance said, adjusting her diamond watch. She is just a simple accountant playing a game she cannot possibly win. She thinks she can run away with my money and fund a life in hiding. Let her have her little domestic abuse petition. It does not matter. I will simply call the bank and freeze the $25 million cashier's check. She will be completely broke and starving by tomorrow morning. She will come crawling back on her knees, begging me to take the children. She pulled a sleek secondary phone from her coat pocket. I will call Gregory right now, Constance boasted, pacing in front of Kylie and Harrison to demonstrate her supreme control over the situation. She dialed the number for her elite offshore wealth manager and put the call on speakerphone, ensuring David, Harrison, and Kylie could hear her fix the problem with a single command. The phone rang twice before Gregory answered. His voice echoed through the speaker, but he did not sound like his usual polished, sycophantic self. He sounded terrified, his breathing ragged and uneven. Gregory. Constance commanded, her tone sharp and authoritative. I need you to issue an immediate stop payment on the $25 million cashier's check I authorized yesterday. Flag it as fraud. Completely freeze the recipient's accounts. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. The only sound was the faint rustling of papers. Ma'am. Gregory finally spoke, his voice trembling so violently that the speaker on the phone vibrated. I cannot do that. Excuse me? Constance snapped, her eyes narrowing. I am your biggest client. You will do exactly as I instruct, or I will ruin your career before lunch. Cancel the check. Ma'am, the 25 million was not drawn from your operational funds. Gregory's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. The routing numbers on the contract you forced her to sign authorized a direct transfer from your hidden Cayman holdings. And it is already cleared. The hidden account is completely empty. Constance stopped breathing. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and suddenly very old. Harrison stopped his frantic pacing, turning slowly to stare at his mother. Kylie backed away from the hospital bed, her eyes darting between the door and the furious people in the room. What did you just say? Constance whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in her life. Gregory swallowed hard, his panic bleeding through the phone speaker. The contract you brought me yesterday. The one you drafted yourself and refused to let the legal team review. The routing numbers at the bottom of the page were altered. You authorized a total liquidation of your offshore safety net. Juliet wired the entire 25 million to an untraceable series of shell companies at 4 a.m. Ma'am, the money is gone. All of it. 3 days passed since the frantic morning in the empty hospital room. The setting shifted from sterile white walls to the breathtaking opulence of the grand ballroom at the Drake Hotel. It was the night of the annual Children's Medical Foundation Gala, the most exclusive charity event in Chicago high society. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the city elite, who mingled over champagne and caviar. Constance stood near a towering ice sculpture wearing a custom emerald silk gown. She held a crystal flute projecting the flawless image of a perfectly content matriarch. Harrison stood beside her, looking terribly pale and exhausted. His tailored tuxedo could not hide the sheer panic that had consumed him for the past 72 hours. He kept shifting his weight, constantly checking his phone for any sign of his missing funds. Kylie was glued to his arm, wearing a sequins dress that was entirely too revealing for a conservative charity event. Wealthy peers and business associates approached them continuously, asking where Juliet was, and congratulating them on the birth of the twins. Constance smiled, her signature practiced smile. She lied effortlessly to every single guest, claiming Juliet was simply resting at home with the babies, exhausted from the delivery, but doing wonderfully. She played the part of the proud grandmother, shielding the fact that her empire was currently hanging by a thread. The orchestra music faded gracefully as the event coordinator tapped the microphone. It was time for the opening remarks. Constance made her way to the center stage, the crowd parting respectfully for her. She loved this part of the evening. She loved the attention, the power, and the intoxicating feeling of holding the entire room in the palm of her hand. She adjusted the microphone and began speaking eloquently about the importance of family legacy and charitable giving. Halfway through a sentence about moral duty and supporting the next generation, a sudden heavy murmur rippled through the back of the ballroom. Heads began to turn one by one. The heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase had swung wide open. The murmurs grew into audible gasps, spreading through the crowd like a wave. Constance stopped speaking mid-sentence, her eyes tracking the movement of the distracted guests. Juliet stood at the top of the stairs. She did not look like a woman who had just undergone major abdominal surgery. She did not look like a frightened mother on the run. She wore a stunning midnight blue evening gown that draped perfectly over her figure. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, elegant knot, and her posture was made of absolute steel. Flanking her on either side were 3 men in sharp, dark suits, carrying leather briefcases. Anyone in Chicago high society recognized them immediately. They were the senior partners of the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state. Juliet descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. Constance gripped the wooden podium so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. Harrison stepped backward in shock, knocking into a passing waiter and sending a silver tray of champagne glasses crashing to the marble floor. The shattering sound broke the remaining tension in the room. Constance abandoned the microphone and marched off the stage, her heels biting furiously into the floor. She intercepted Juliet at the bottom of the staircase, grabbing her forcefully by the arm. She dragged Juliet away from the flashing cameras and the whispering crowd, shoving her through the heavy wooden doors of the private VIP lounge. Harrison and Kylie scrambled in right behind them, locking the doors to secure their privacy. The three towering lawyers stood just outside the glass doors, acting as an impenetrable wall between Juliet and the rest of the gala. Constance whirled around, her face twisted with absolute fury. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Juliet. "You are a glorified calculator, Juliet. You think you can steal my money and show your face in my city like nothing happened. I will bury you in litigation until you are begging to give me my grandchildren back. I will make sure you never work in this state again, and I will ruin your name." Kylie decided this was her moment to contribute to the intimidation. She stepped out from behind Harrison, crossing her arms and looking Juliet up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "You really have some nerve showing up here," she sneered, her voice dripping with malice. "Look at you. You just had a baby, and you are trying to squeeze into couture. You look ridiculous. Harrison is finally with a real woman who understands his actual needs, a woman who knows how to treat a man right. You are nothing but a cold, bitter accountant who could not keep her husband happy." Juliet did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She walked calmly over to the private bar, poured herself a glass of sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The profound calmness of her movement infuriated Constance even further. Juliet set the glass down and turned to face the three of them, her expression completely unbothered. "You want to talk about burying things?" Constance Juliet asked, her voice perfectly level and quiet. "Just like you buried the $14 million you embezzled from Harrison's late father's estate to fund your failing commercial real estate ventures." The silence in the VIP lounge became absolute and suffocating. Harrison froze completely, his eyes darting frantically between his mother and his wife. Constance opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Juliet took a single step forward, closing the distance between them. "You called me a glorified calculator," she continued softly. "You were entirely right. I am exceptional with numbers. For the last 9 months of my high-risk pregnancy, while Harrison was busy taking Kylie to Paris, and you were planning how to take my children, I was conducting a full forensic audit of your entire financial empire. I traced every single stolen dime, Constance. I traced the money you hid from the Internal Revenue Service. I traced the trust funds you drained from your own son to keep your sinking commercial properties afloat. You left a very messy paper trail." Harrison stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and dawning rage. "Mom, what is she talking about? What $14 million? That money was supposed to be securely locked in the family trust. You told me the market took a massive downturn and we lost the capital." Constance scrambled to regain control of the narrative. "Do not listen to her, Harrison," she stammered, reaching out to grab his arm. "She is lying. She is trying to turn us against each other to distract from the fact that she stole my grandchildren." Juliet reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a small silver flash drive. She tossed it onto the glass coffee table, where it landed with a sharp metallic clink. "Every bank statement, every forged signature, every illegal offshore transfer is on that drive," Juliet said, pointing to the table. "I handed a complete copy over to the federal authorities 3 hours ago. You did not just steal from your husband, Constance. You stole from the federal government, and they do not take kindly to massive tax evasion." The fragile alliance between the villains fractured in an instant. Harrison looked at his mother with utter disgust, realizing that his entire life of perceived wealth and status had been built on money stolen directly from his own inheritance. He backed away from her, shaking his head in disbelief, and wiping his hands on his trousers as if she had burned him. "You stole from me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You told me Juliet was the problem. You made me hate her, but you were robbing me blind the entire time." Kylie realized the gravity of the situation and immediately stepped away from Harrison. The promise of endless wealth was rapidly vanishing before her eyes, and she wanted no part of a federal investigation. Constance realized she was losing her grip on her son and her untouchable status. Complete panic set in, but her arrogant pride demanded she prove her dominance to the world. She refused to be humiliated by a woman she considered far beneath her station. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the VIP lounge, pushing past the lawyers and marching straight back into the main ballroom. The charity auction had just begun. The auctioneer was standing on the stage, enthusiastically presenting a luxury European vacation package to the wealthy crowd. Constance needed the room to see her wealth. She needed to remind everyone who she was and command their respect. She walked right up to the front of the stage and raised her hand high into the air. $100,000, she shouted, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. The crowd gasped and the massive opening bid breaking into polite applause. Constance smiled triumphantly, pulling her signature black card from her clutch and slamming it onto the auctioneer's table. "Charge it right now," she commanded loudly enough for the front rows to hear clearly. The auctioneer looked surprised, but quickly handed the heavy metal card to the financial coordinator sitting beside the stage. The room waited in hushed anticipation for the transaction to clear. Constance turned around to face the crowd, specifically looking for Juliet to rub her perceived victory in her face. Juliet was standing gracefully by the VIP lounge doors, holding her glass of sparkling water, with a serene expression. A few agonizing moments passed. The financial coordinator swiped the card again, looking increasingly distressed. He typed frantically on his keyboard and then whispered something urgent to the auctioneer. The auctioneer cleared his throat and leaned heavily toward the microphone, his face flushed with extreme discomfort. "I apologize, Constance," the auctioneer said, his voice booming through the silent room, causing the guests to lean forward. "The card has been declined." Constance stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Run it again," she demanded, her voice growing shrill and frantic. "That is a limitless card. There must be a system mistake. Run it again." The auctioneer looked down at the terminal screen and then back up at Constance, his expression full of pity. "I am very sorry, ma'am, but there is no mistake. In fact, I have just been informed by the banking authorization system that all of your accounts are currently frozen under a federal tax lien. You have zero available funds." The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers and loud gasps. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths, turning to each other in absolute disbelief. The untouchable matriarch of Chicago high society, the woman who had ruled them with an iron fist, had just been publicly exposed as a broke fraud. Constance stood frozen in front of the brightly lit stage, completely humiliated and entirely ruined. Across the opulent room, standing tall and victorious, Juliet smiled a genuine bright smile and slowly raised her glass in a silent, satisfying toast. The news of the frozen accounts ripped through the grand ballroom like a shockwave. The polite applause and classical music that had filled the air just moments before were entirely replaced by a deafening chorus of frantic whispers. The wealthiest and most influential people in Chicago were actively stepping away from the auction stage, putting physical distance between themselves and Constance. In their world, there was no sin greater than running out of money, and no disease more contagious than a federal tax investigation. Constance stood paralyzed under the bright stage lights, her face a portrait of utter devastation as the reality of her public ruin settled in. From his spot near the private lounge doors, Harrison watched his mother completely unravel. The words "federal tax lien" echoed in his mind over and over again. His heart hammered against his ribs and a cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck. The family fortune, the sprawling real estate portfolio, the offshore accounts, and the endless stream of cash he had relied on since birth were gone. He was completely broke. He looked around the room and saw the judging eyes of his peers staring at him with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Panic, a raw and primal fear, seized him. He turned his attention across the room to Juliet. She was still standing with perfect posture, surrounded by her formidable legal team, looking entirely serene. The $25 million. That was the only liquid cash left. In his desperate, frantic mind, that money belonged to him. It was his family legacy, and Juliet had stolen it. Harrison shoved his way through the crowd of gaping socialites, Kylie trailing nervously behind him. He marched up to Juliet, his face flushed red with anger and entitlement. You need to give that money back right now, Harrison demanded, his voice shaking with a pathetic attempt at authority. That is family money, Juliet. You manipulated my mother while she was under severe emotional distress. You took advantage of a hospital transfer and you committed wire fraud. You are going to transfer every single cent of that $25 million back into my account, or I will have you arrested before this gala is over. Juliet did not even blink. She handed her glass of sparkling water to one of the attorneys standing beside her. She looked at Harrison with an expression of profound pity, a look that infuriated him more than any insult could have. Family money? Juliet repeated, her voice calm and remarkably clear, cutting through the surrounding noise. Which family money are you referring to, Harrison? Are you referring to the millions your mother stole from your late father's estate? Or are you referring to the money your mistress has been siphoning out of your personal accounts for the last 8 months? Harrison froze, his angry tirade dying in his throat. He blinked, staring at Juliet in total confusion. He glanced back at Kylie, who suddenly looked incredibly pale, her eyes darting toward the ballroom exit. What are you talking about? Harrison asked, his voice dropping to an uncertain whisper. Juliet gestured to her lead attorney, who stepped forward and handed her a thick, heavy manila folder. Juliet dropped the folder onto the high cocktail table, separating them. The sound of the heavy paper slapping against the glass top made Harrison flinch. Did you really think my forensic audit stopped with Constance? Juliet asked, tilting her head slightly. Once I found the irregularities in the main holding company, I decided to look into your personal accounts. I wanted to see exactly how much of our marital assets you were spending on your lavish weekend trips. But what I found was far more interesting. Juliet opened the folder and spread several printed bank statements and wire transfer logs across the table. They were highlighted and meticulously annotated. You have been giving Kylie full access to your platinum cards and your secondary checking accounts. Juliet explained, her tone as clinical as a professor giving a lecture. You thought she was using those funds for shopping sprees and spa days, but she has been systematically funneling thousands of dollars every week into a dummy corporation registered in Delaware. Harrison stared at the highlighted numbers, his mind struggling to comprehend the massive sums of money bleeding out of his accounts. I traced the dummy corporation, Juliet continued. It belongs to a man named Marcus. He is a mechanic in Denver, and according to the private investigator I hired, he is also Kylie's boyfriend of 5 years. You see, Harrison, Kylie is not a naive young woman swept up by your charm. She is a serial grifter. She targets wealthy, deeply insecure men who need constant validation. She plays the loving, devoted partner, drains their accounts, and sends the money back to her actual boyfriend. You were nothing but a mark to her. Harrison felt the air leave his lungs. He slowly turned around to look at Kylie, expecting her to burst into tears. He expected her to vehemently deny the accusations, to call Juliet a liar, and to beg him to believe in their love. He needed her to tell him that the future they had planned, the nursery they had decorated, and the life they were going to build together were real. Instead, Kylie was staring down at the bank statements on the cocktail table. She did not look sad. She did not look falsely accused. Her shoulders relaxed, her posture shifted, and the sweet, adoring facade she had worn for a year melted away entirely. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh that sounded like cracking ice. Kylie looked up from the table and met Harrison's pleading eyes. Her expression was completely devoid of empathy. She looked at him the way one looks at a discarded piece of trash. Are you actually surprised? Kylie asked, her voice dropping its usual breathy pitch and taking on a hard, cynical edge. Look at yourself, Harrison. Did you really think I wanted to spend my 20s holding your hand while your mother dictated every single decision in your life? Did you really think I wanted to play stepmother to crying twins while dealing with a broke mama's boy who cannot even tie his own shoes without asking for permission? Harrison stood completely paralyzed, the brutal words hitting him harder than a physical blow. You said you loved me, he whispered, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. You said I was the only man who truly understood you. You were the only man gullible enough to give me your bank routing numbers without asking questions. Kylie shot back, rolling her eyes. It was a job, Harrison. And honestly, Listening to you complain about your wife working too hard while you sat around spending your mother's money was the hardest work I have ever done. I earned every single dime I took from you. Without another word, Kylie reached down and adjusted the strap of the incredibly expensive designer purse Harrison had bought her for her birthday. She turned on her heel, her sequins dress catching the light of the chandeliers, and began walking toward the main exit of the ballroom. She moved with purpose, pushing past the whispering guests, without a shred of shame. She did not look back. She simply walked out of the gala and out of Harrison's life, leaving him completely stranded in a sea of judging faces. Harrison was left standing alone at the cocktail table, his entire world reduced to rubble. His mother was publicly ruined and facing federal charges. His wife had outsmarted him entirely and secured sole custody of their children. His fortune was gone, and the woman he had destroyed his marriage for had just exposed him as a pathetic, easily manipulated fool. The socialites around him were openly staring, whispering behind their hands, and shaking their heads in pity and disgust. He could not breathe. The walls of the grand ballroom felt like they were closing in on him. He needed an escape. He needed guidance. He needed the one person who had always fixed his mistakes and shielded him from the consequences of his own actions. He needed his mother. Harrison pushed his way blindly through the crowd, ignoring the voices calling his name. He practically ran down the grand staircase and out the front doors of the Drake Hotel, bursting into the cool night air. He handed his ticket to the valet with shaking hands, tossing the man a crumpled $20 bill and demanding his car immediately. He drove out of the city limits, heading north toward the exclusive gated communities where the family estate was located. He drove recklessly, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. His mind raced with frantic, disjointed thoughts. Constance always had a backup plan. She had to have a hidden safe, a stash of bearer bonds, or a contact who could make this all go away. The federal government could not simply erase the most powerful family in Chicago overnight. It was impossible. He just needed to get to the mansion, regroup with his mother, and let her lawyers handle the fallout. He sped down the familiar tree-lined road that led to the estate, taking the final curve far too fast. The massive wrought iron gates that secured the property came into view. Harrison reached for the remote clipped to his sun visor, ready to buzz himself inside the fortress. But he did not need the remote. The heavy iron gates were stuck wide open, locked into place. Harrison slowed the car as he turned up the long circular driveway, his headlights sweeping across the pristine manicured lawn. His heart dropped into his stomach. The driveway was not empty. 3 massive commercial moving trucks were parked haphazardly across the cobblestones, their loading ramps extended downward. Harrison slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park and throwing his door open. He stumbled out onto the driveway, staring at the chaos unfolding in front of his childhood home. The front doors of the mansion were propped wide open. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers with heavy yellow federal insignias printed across their backs were moving methodically in and out of the house. They were carrying heavy cardboard boxes loaded with financial records, computers, and artwork. Harrison tried to run forward toward the front steps, but a tall, stern-looking agent stepped into his path, holding up a hand to stop him. "You cannot go in there," the agent said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of the federal government. "This property is now under federal jurisdiction." Harrison looked past the agent, staring at the beautiful custom mahogany front doors of the estate. Another agent was standing on the front porch, smoothing a massive, bright yellow federal seizure notice directly onto the polished wood. The house, the cars, the assets, everything was gone. Harrison fell to his knees on the cold cobblestone driveway, completely and utterly alone in the dark. The cold reality of the yellow federal seizure notice finally forced Harrison off the cobblestones. He stumbled back to his sports car, his hands shaking so violently he could barely get the key into the ignition. He spent the entire night shivering in the leather driver's seat, parked under the harsh fluorescent lights of a suburban strip mall. He watched his cell phone battery slowly die along with every option he thought he had. By mid-morning, raw desperation drove him to track down the one person whose brilliant mind had always managed the details of his life. It took calling a private investigator on a borrowed phone paid for with his last remaining cash to find her. Harrison arrived at the address just before noon. It was an ultra-exclusive high-security glass skyscraper nestled right on the Chicago River. The kind of building where residents had private elevators, and the lobby looked like a modern art museum. Harrison pushed through the revolving doors looking like an absolute wreck. His expensive tuxedo was crumpled and stained, his bow tie hung loosely around his neck, and he smelled of stale sweat and sheer panic. He marched up to the front desk, attempting to project his usual arrogant authority, but the sharp-eyed concierge was unimpressed. Harrison demanded to be led up to his wife's penthouse. The concierge calmly picked up a phone, spoke quietly for a moment, and then informed Harrison he would have to wait in the lobby. 5 minutes later, the polished steel doors of a private elevator slid open. Juliet stepped out into the expansive marble lobby. She looked completely ethereal. She wore a tailored cream pantsuit that fit her perfectly, radiating absolute power and total rest. She held a sleek tablet in one hand, her demeanor as calm as a placid lake. Two broad-shouldered security guards stood a few paces behind her, their eyes locked entirely on Harrison. Juliet Harrison breathed, taking a step forward. The security guards immediately stepped up, blocking his path. Harrison threw his hands up in a gesture of surrender, backing away. He looked at his wife and decided to play the only card he thought he had left. He played the victim. "Juliet, please! You have to listen to me!" Harrison begged, his voice cracking as he put on his best performance of a broken man. "My mother is completely insane. I see that now. She manipulated me, Juliet. She poisoned my mind against you. And Kylie, she was a con artist, a grifter who used me. I was blind and stupid, but I am awake now. I left them both. I want to come home. I want to be a real husband to you. I want to see my son and daughter. Please, let me see our children." Juliet did not soften. She did not take a step toward him. She looked at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a particularly pathetic insect under a microscope. "You do not have a home with me, Harrison," Juliet said, her voice echoing clearly across the pristine lobby. "And you certainly do not have a son and daughter. You surrendered your rights the moment you let your mother throw a $25 million check onto my hospital bed." Harrison felt his desperate act crumbling. The realization that his begging was completely ineffective triggered his deeply ingrained entitlement. His face flushed a dark, angry red. The pathetic weeping husband vanished instantly, replaced by the vicious bully he had always been beneath the surface. "You cannot do this to me!" Harrison shouted, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You cannot keep a father away from his flesh and blood. You think you won because you handed some bank statements over to the feds. You think you destroyed my mother. My family built this city, Juliet. Do you really think a temporary tax lien stops us?" He took another step forward, ignoring the warning glare of the security guards. "We still have judges on speed dial," Harrison threatened, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I will drag you through family court so fast your head will spin. My mother will file for grandparents' rights. We will build a case against you. We will tell the judge about your little disappearing act from the hospital. We will paint you as a mentally unstable postpartum nightmare who kidnapped my children in the middle of the night. I will have court-ordered custody by Friday, and you will be completely ruined." Juliet did not argue. She did not raise her voice to match his frantic screaming. She simply let out a long, weary sigh. "You really should be more careful about the smart integration system in your sports car," Harrison Juliet said, her tone conversational. "When you sync your phone to the vehicle, it automatically backs up the audio logs to the primary family cloud account, an account I set up and actively monitor." Harrison froze, his arm dropping slowly to his side. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Juliet unlocked her tablet with a swift tap of her finger. She adjusted the volume button on the side and pressed play. The audio rang out crisp and undeniable in the quiet lobby. It was Harrison's own voice, recorded exactly 3 weeks prior. He sounded relaxed, laughing as the hum of a car engine played in the background. "Once my mother pays off Juliet, we will just dump the twins in a Swiss boarding school," Harrison's recorded voice said lazily. "I am not changing diapers, Kylie. I don't want them ruining our vibe. My mother just wants the bloodlines secured. Once she has them, she will triple my trust fund allowance, and we can finally buy that villa in Monaco." Juliet tapped the screen, stopping the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. "You do not care about being a father, Harrison," Juliet stated, her voice dropping to a sharp, icy register. "You never wanted those children. You complained about my pregnancy for 9 months because it took attention away from you. You did not want to be a parent. You only wanted to please Constance so she would keep funding your luxurious, lazy lifestyle. You treated my babies like bargaining chips to secure your allowance." Harrison was sweating profusely now. The recording was a death blow to any custody case he could ever hope to build. Any family court judge would throw him out of the room the second they heard his own voice plotting to abandon the infants in a foreign country. He was cornered, entirely stripped of his usual defenses. Panic gripped his chest, squeezing his lungs. He needed power. He needed a weapon to strike back at the woman who was dismantling his entire existence. He grabbed onto the very last shred of his family's empire, the one piece of the puzzle he firmly believed was completely untouchable. "You think you are so brilliant." Harrison snarled, his chest heaving as he glared at her. "You think you cornered me because you froze my mother's personal accounts. You are nothing but a glorified bookkeeper, Juliet. You only saw the surface." He let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, trying to project a dominance he did not truly feel. "You forgot about the overarching holding company. You forgot about the master corporate entity that controls every single piece of our remaining commercial real estate." Harrison stood taller, puffing his chest out. "The Internal Revenue Service cannot touch the holding company because it is legally insulated by 3 different corporate trusts. It is an impenetrable fortress. My mother might be locked out of her personal cash, but I am still a primary voting board member of that entity." He pointed his finger at her again, his eyes wide with manic desperation. "I am going to call an emergency shareholder meeting this afternoon. I will have the board vote to immediately liquidate 3 of our downtown high-rises. I will have $50 million in untraceable liquid cash by tomorrow morning. I am going to hire a legal team so massive and so vicious that they will drown you in paperwork for the rest of your natural life. I will out-litigate you, Juliet. I will crush you until you have absolutely nothing left." Juliet did not look afraid. She did not look intimidated by his grand corporate threats. Instead, she looked at him with an expression of mild amusement. She slowly lowered the tablet to her side. A soft, genuine smile broke across her face. She tilted her head slightly, studying the pathetic man she had once called her husband. What holding company, Harrison? Harrison stumbled backward toward the revolving doors of the penthouse lobby, his mind fracturing under the weight of his wife's serene smile. He did not know what she meant by asking what holding company, but the sheer terror clawing at his chest told him he did not want to find out. He fled out onto the Chicago streets, a displaced prince with no kingdom left to claim. 48 hours later, the polished mahogany table of the overarching family holding company reflected the anxious faces of 12 extremely wealthy investors. The boardroom sat on the 60th floor of the city's most iconic skyscraper, an architectural marvel that served as the crown jewel of the family real estate portfolio. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirroring the tempest brewing inside the room. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and unadulterated panic. Constance stood at the head of the massive table. She had been released on federal bail just 12 hours prior. The brief stint in federal custody had stripped away some of her pristine lacquer. The dark circles under her eyes were heavily concealed with powder, and her tailored charcoal suit hung slightly loose on her frame. But her chin was raised, her posture rigidly upright, and she projected a manufactured aura of absolute invincibility. She was fighting for her life, and she knew the only way to survive was to bend these 12 men to her iron will. "We are facing a temporary liquidity crisis, gentlemen," Constance announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls with practiced authority. She paced slowly behind her leather chair, making deliberate eye contact with the most hesitant investors. "I will not insult your intelligence by pretending the last few days have not been challenging. The federal tax lien is an unfortunate bureaucratic misunderstanding. It is a temporary freeze that my legal team will untangle by the end of the quarter. An older investor near the back of the table cleared his throat, adjusting his tie nervously. Constance, a federal seizure notice on the family estate, is not a simple misunderstanding. The markets are panicking. The stock price of our subsidiaries is plummeting. We need liquid capital right now, or the banks are going to call in the leverage loans on the downtown properties. Constance smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that did not reach her eyes. Exactly, she agreed, smoothing the lapels of her suit jacket. Which is why I have called this emergency meeting. We need to liquidate. I am proposing the immediate sale of our 3 primary commercial assets, including this very building. A shockwave of loud murmurs tore through the boardroom. Several men shot out of their seats protesting the drastic measure. Selling the primary assets would essentially gut the holding company, turning a century-old real estate empire into a pile of fast cash. Listen to me, Constance demanded, slamming her palm flat against the mahogany wood to silence the room. You are panicking over a localized storm. This entire situation is nothing but a vengeful hormonal breakdown. My daughter-in-law Juliet recently gave birth and has suffered a complete mental collapse. She is a bitter, unstable woman who filed a series of fabricated whistleblower reports to the federal authorities simply because she is angry about my son's request for a divorce. She is trying to burn our family down out of pure feminine spite. Constance leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. She manipulated federal agents with forged documents and stole $25 million from my private offshore safety net. But she is just a single unhinged accountant. We are an institution. If we vote to liquidate these 3 properties right now, we will generate over $400 million in untraceable liquid cash. That is more than enough to satisfy the IRS, pay off the leverage loans, and hire a cutthroat legal team to absolutely destroy Juliet in federal court. I will have her locked in a psychiatric ward or a federal penitentiary by the end of the month. But I need your vote to unlock the assets. The investors looked at each other, their faces pale with greed and fear. They did not care about family drama or postpartum mental health. They cared about their dividends. The promise of a $400 million cash injection was a powerful narcotic. Constance saw their hesitation turning into compliance. She had them. She always got them in the end. I motioned to initiate the immediate liquidation of the primary commercial assets. Constance stated, her voice ringing with triumphant finality. All those in favor, raise your hands. 3 men instantly raised their hands, then 4, then 7. Just as the 8th investor began to lift his arm, the heavy oak boardroom doors burst open with a deafening crash. The heavy wood slammed against the drywall, causing the expensive artwork on the walls to rattle. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Juliet walked into the boardroom. She wore a perfectly tailored crimson business suit, her posture radiating a cold, untouchable authority. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor, breaking the stunned silence of the room. Flanking her were 4 towering men in dark suits. They were not just lawyers. They were the senior partners of the firm's acquisitions and mergers department. Juliet walked directly toward the opposite end of the mahogany table. She did not look at the investors. Her eyes were locked entirely on Constance. When she reached the end of the table, she dropped a heavy, sleek titanium briefcase directly onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot. Constance felt the blood freeze in her veins. Her triumphant smile contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "What is the meaning of this?" Constance shrieked, her voice breaking its carefully modulated pitch. She pointed a shaking finger at the heavy double doors. "Security! Get security up here immediately. You have no right to be in this building, Juliet. This is a closed emergency shareholder meeting for the overarching holding company. You hold no shares. You have no voting power. You have no legal standing to even breathe the air in this room." Juliet ignored the screaming. She unclasped the titanium briefcase, clicking the locks open with a slow, deliberate precision. Constance marched around the table, her face flushed with furious indignation. She turned to the gaping investors, attempting to regain her dominant narrative. "Look at her. Constance yelled, gesturing wildly toward Juliet. "This is exactly the unstable behavior I was telling you about. She is trespassing. She is completely out of her mind." She turned her venom back toward her daughter-in-law, her voice dripping with aristocratic disgust. "You are a nobody accountant who married into a legacy you could never comprehend. You think because you stole a few $1 million you can sit at the adults' table. You are nothing but a middle-class calculator. Get out of my boardroom before I have you arrested for corporate espionage." Juliet did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not even look angry. She simply reached into her sleek briefcase and pulled out a digital tablet. She tapped the screen a few times, moving with a serene grace that made Constance look entirely unhinged by comparison. Juliet picked up the display cable resting in the center console of the mahogany table. She plugged it directly into her tablet. The massive digital projector screen mounted behind Constance automatically hummed to life. It slowly descended from the ceiling, blocking out the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The room plunged into a cinematic darkness, illuminated only by the bright white glow of the projector. The 12 wealthy investors turned their leather chairs toward the massive screen, their eyes widening in confusion. Constance froze, turning slowly to look over her own shoulder. Projected onto the massive screen in crystal-clear high definition was a legal document. It was a scanned copy of a contract, the very same custody transfer contract Constance had drafted herself, the exact same paper she had thrown onto Juliet's sterile hospital bed just days prior when she tried to buy her newborn grandchildren for $25 million. Constance stared at the projected image, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized her own bold, arrogant signature at the bottom of the page right next to Juliet's neat, precise handwriting. She recognized the offshore bank routing numbers she had manually altered to ensure the funds came from her secret Cayman Island accounts. Juliet stood at the end of the table, bathed in the glow of the projector. She looked at Constance with an expression of mild, polite disappointment. "You should really read what you sign," Constance, Juliet said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent boardroom. Juliet tapped her tablet screen. The massive projected image zoomed in rapidly, blurring the top paragraphs and focusing entirely on the fine print at the very bottom of the contract. It was a section buried beneath layers of dense, confusing legal jargon that Constance had skipped over in her arrogant rush to secure the family bloodline. Constance squinted at the massive text, reading the words silently. Her lips moved, forming the legal phrases, but her brain refused to process the devastating reality of what she was seeing. The blood roared in her ears. Juliet traced her finger along her tablet, highlighting the specific projected paragraph in bright neon yellow for every investor in the room to see. "When you bypassed your legal team to draft this horrific custody agreement, you used a template from the holding company archives," Juliet explained, her tone incredibly pleasant and helpful. "But when I signed the document in that hospital room, I made a few small, immediate amendments to the digital file before authorizing the bank transfer." Juliet took a single step forward, her eyes locking onto Constance's terrified face. "I did not just take the $25 million, Constance. I inserted a primary equity transfer clause. By signing that document and authorizing the financial exchange, you legally triggered an irrevocable transfer of all your primary voting shares in the holding company directly to me." The investors gasped, sinking back into their leather chairs. Constance grabbed the back of her chair, her knees buckling under her weight. "You do not own this holding company anymore," Constance, Juliet stated clearly, the final nail in the coffin of the Chicago empire. "I own it. Every single skyscraper, every commercial lease, and every corporate asset now belongs entirely to me. And I am vetoing the liquidation." The 12 elite investors sitting around the massive mahogany table erupted into a frantic chorus of overlapping voices. Heavy leather chairs scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor as men in bespoke suits jumped to their feet, demanding immediate explanations. Constance stood absolutely rigid at the head of the table, staring at the massive projection screen as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the wood so tightly her knuckles turned a mottled white. She recognized the font, the standard formatting of her company's legal department, and her own bold signature at the bottom of the page, but the actual substance of the text made absolutely no sense to her panicked brain. "This is a forgery!" Constance finally screamed, her voice echoing shrilly over the chaotic noise of the boardroom. She slammed her fist down hard, causing crystal water glasses to tremble and spill across the table. "I never signed a transfer of equity. I signed a standard non-disclosure and custody relinquishment agreement. You doctored this digital document, Juliet. You hacked the system to save yourself. I will have you thrown in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud before the sun sets." Juliet did not raise her voice to match the frantic screaming of her former mother-in-law. She simply shook her head, projecting an image of absolute serene pity that cut Constance deeper than any shouted insult ever could. "I did not forge a single syllable," Constance, Juliet said, stepping away from the projector and pacing slowly along the length of the table. "Every word projected on that screen is exactly what was printed on the heavy cardstock you threw onto my hospital bed 3 days ago. You signed it in blue ink right in front of me. Your son Harrison stood right there and witnessed it. Your corrupt lawyer David confirmed the signature before realizing what the text actually meant. It is an ironclad, legally binding contract recognized by the state and the federal banking authorities." The wealthy investors fell completely silent, hanging on every word of the exchange. Constance shook her head in furious, violent denial, but Juliet pressed forward, refusing to let the ruined matriarch regain a single inch of ground. "You have a fatal flaw," Constance Juliet continued, her voice ringing with icy, undeniable clarity. "Your arrogance blinds you to your own vulnerabilities. You view everyone around you as incompetent, and you believe you are the smartest person in any room you enter. For the past 3 years, you have used the exact same master template from the holding company archives for every major non-disclosure agreement and private settlement. You never bothered to read the actual text anymore because you assumed you already knew exactly what it said." Juliet stopped pacing and leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished mahogany directly across from Constance. She stared directly into the older woman's terrified eyes. "6 weeks ago, when I realized you were planning to use my unborn children as leverage to control Harrison, I accessed the secure server using my executive accounting clearance," Juliet explained. "I located your favorite master template, and I made a few critical adjustments. I rewrote the entire boilerplate section regarding financial compensation. I replaced the standard confidentiality clauses with an irrevocable transfer of corporate assets." The color completely drained from Constance's face, leaving her skin a sickly grayish white. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing her to grip the back of her heavy chair to keep from collapsing to the floor. "You knew I would use that template," Constance whispered, her voice hollow and trembling with a horrifying realization. Juliet nodded, a sharp single motion of confirmation. "I knew you would not be able to resist handling the transaction personally," Juliet explained, her tone incredibly pleasant and helpful. "Your corporate lawyers are the best in Chicago. If you had let them review the final printed draft of the contract, they would have spotted the equity transfer clause in 3 seconds. They would have stopped you immediately. But your massive ego would never allow that. You wanted the personal satisfaction of walking into my recovery suite and delivering the final blow yourself. You wanted to watch me break. You bypassed your entire legal team because you wanted the supreme glory of buying my bloodline with your own 2 hands." A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. The wealthy investors looked at Constance with utter revulsion, realizing that their massive investments and personal fortunes had been jeopardized by the petty, vindictive ego of a grandstanding matriarch. Juliet tapped her tablet one final time, bringing up a new high-definition document on the massive screen. It was a certificate of incorporation bearing the official gold seal of the state. "When you signed that document, Constance, you did not just hand me your voting shares," Juliet stated, her tone ringing with absolute finality. "You legally transferred your entire controlling interest in this overarching holding company into the newly established Twins Trust Fund. It is a highly secure financial trust created for the sole benefit of my son and daughter. And as their mother and primary legal guardian, I am the sole managing director of that trust. I have complete unilateral control over every single asset within this massive corporate portfolio. Constance stumbled backward, her expensive heels catching on the thick carpet. She looked frantically around the room, seeking an ally, seeking anyone who would defend her legacy. But the investors were already turning their backs on her. They were ruthless, pragmatic businessmen who only cared about self-preservation and profit margins. They instantly recognized that the power dynamic in the room had permanently and completely shifted. The woman they had feared and respected for decades was now nothing more than a desperate broke criminal facing federal tax evasion charges. An older investor with silver hair and a sharp-tailored suit stepped forward, addressing Juliet directly. He completely ignored Constance as she gasped for air beside him. "Mrs. Juliet," the investor began, his tone shifting from panic to cautious respect. "If you truly control the majority shares, what is your intention regarding the federal tax lien against the primary accounts? Constance owes the government millions. The holding company is in severe danger if the authorities freeze our operational capital." Juliet offered the man a reassuring professional smile. She knew exactly how to speak their language. "The federal tax lien is tied exclusively to Constance's personal accounts and the offshore accounts she illegally utilized," Juliet explained smoothly, gesturing to her team of elite lawyers. "The overarching holding company and its primary commercial assets are completely insulated from her individual criminal activity. I have already dispatched my legal team to meet directly with the federal prosecutors. We are providing them with full cooperation and absolute financial transparency. This company is entirely secure, gentlemen. Your investments are completely safe. The only thing being liquidated today is Constance's involvement in this empire." The investors let out a collective sigh of profound relief. Shoulders dropped, and the tense, aggressive posture of the room immediately softened. They looked at Juliet not as a rogue accountant, but as their new savior. She had neutralized a massive federal threat and stabilized their wealth in a single calculated strike. Constance watched her entire life, her status, her power, and her legacy evaporate before her eyes. The realization that she had literally signed away her empire due to her own blinding arrogance finally shattered the last remaining pieces of her sanity. She let out a guttural, high-pitched scream of pure, unfiltered rage. She lunged forward across the mahogany table, her hands outstretched like claws, aiming directly for Juliet's throat. "I will kill you!" Constance shrieked. Her face twisted into a terrifying mask of absolute madness. "I built this company. It belongs to me. You cannot take my life away from me, you miserable little thief." Before Constance could even clear the center console, the four towering lawyers flanking Juliet stepped forward smoothly and professionally, intercepting the frantic woman. They grabbed Constance by the arms, pinning her securely and effortlessly. She thrashed and kicked violently, screaming obscenities that echoed off the glass walls, completely shattering any remaining illusion of her aristocratic dignity. Her designer suit jacket tore at the shoulder, and her hair fell in a messy tangle across her face. Juliet did not even flinch. She stood perfectly still, watching the pathetic physical display of the woman who had tormented her for years. The woman who had tried to steal her newborn children was now reduced to a flailing, screaming mess, being held back by corporate attorneys. Juliet calmly reached out and closed her titanium briefcase, snapping the metal locks shut with a sharp, satisfying click. She looked directly into Constance's wild, furious eyes, holding her gaze until the older woman finally stopped thrashing. "You don't have the authority to liquidate this company." Constance, Juliet announced, her voice echoing through the gasping boardroom with absolute chilling authority. "Because as of this morning, my twins own 85% of it. You are officially trespassing on my property. Security, please escort my former mother-in-law out of my building." The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing off the frantic, overlapping shouts of the ruined men inside the boardroom. Juliet stood in the pristine executive corridor, the muffled chaos behind her sounding like a distant storm. She smoothed the lapels of her crimson suit, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of total victory settling into her bones. The empire was secured, Constance was destroyed, Harrison was neutralized. She turned and walked toward the private executive elevator. The polished steel doors slid open instantly, waiting for the new master of the building. Juliet stepped inside, pressing the button for the subterranean parking garage. The descent was smooth and silent, a quiet moment of transition between the battlefield of the boardroom and the life she had fought so fiercely to protect. The elevator doors chimed and parted, revealing the dimly lit expanse of the VIP parking level. The air was cool and smelled of damp concrete and high-octane exhaust. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the painted pavement as she approached her custom black SUV, which sat isolated in the corner of the secure facility. As she raised her key fob to unlock the doors, a figure detached itself from the shadow of a massive concrete pillar. Well, look who finally decided to crawl out of the background. Juliet paused, her hand hovering over the door handle. She turned slowly. Kylie stepped into the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the parking garage. The former mistress looked significantly degraded from the polished, impeccably styled woman who had paraded around Harrison's penthouse. Her blonde extensions were frizzy at the ends, and her designer trench coat looked heavily rumpled, as if she had been sleeping in it for 2 days. The massive diamond engagement ring Harrison had so proudly flaunted was conspicuously missing from her left hand, likely pawned for quick cash the moment Constance's accounts were frozen. Yet despite her frayed edges, Kylie still wore a mask of supreme, overconfident arrogance. She sauntered forward, her hips swaying with practiced, deliberate exaggeration. She leaned her back casually against the passenger side door of Juliet's SUV, blocking the entrance and crossing her arms over her chest. "You really blew up the castle, Juliet," Kylie said, clicking her tongue as she offered a condescending, predatory smile. "I have to admit, I am almost impressed. I spent 6 months playing the perfect adoring bimbo to get my hands on Constance's offshore accounts. And you took the whole empire with a single piece of paper. Not bad for a boring little number cruncher." Juliet did not flinch. She observed the younger woman with the same clinical detachment a biologist might use to study a particularly annoying parasite. "You are trespassing, Kylie. The security detail in this garage is highly efficient. I suggest you step away from my vehicle before I have them remove you just as violently as they removed Constance." Kylie threw her head back and let out a sharp, grating laugh that echoed harshly off the concrete walls. "Oh, please. You are not calling security, Juliet, because you and I need to have a little business discussion, a severance negotiation, if you will." Juliet arched an eyebrow. "You want severance? From me?" Kylie pushed off the car, taking 2 aggressive steps toward Juliet. Her mask of playful mockery vanished, replaced by a hard, desperate cruelty. "I want $5 million, Kylie demanded, her voice dropping to a vicious hiss. "I earned that money. I spent half a year listening to Harrison complain about his golf swing and his terrible mother. I endured those agonizing, stuffy family dinners. I put in the work, Juliet. And thanks to your little hostile takeover, Harrison is completely broke, and Constance's bank accounts are locked tight. You derailed my payday, so you are going to compensate me for my lost time." "And why exactly would I give you a single dime?" Juliet asked, her tone perfectly conversational. "Because if you do not wire $5 million into my account by midnight, I am going straight to the press." Kylie threatened, stepping closer and invading Juliet's personal space. "I already have a contact at a major national tabloid. I will give them the exclusive inside scoop on the spectacular collapse of the Chicago real estate empire. I will tell them all about the bitter, unstable wife who had a postpartum psychotic break. I will say you abandoned your husband, kidnapped your newborn twins in the middle of the night, and used fraudulent documents to steal a century-old family legacy." Kylie smiled, her eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "I will spin a story so scandalous, so incredibly damaging, that the holding company's shareholders will panic and force you out. The federal authorities will open an investigation into your mental fitness. I will ruin the pristine reputation you need to run this massive company, Juliet. I will drag your name through the mud until you are a total pariah in this city. $5 million is a bargain to make me disappear quietly." Juliet looked at the desperate, grasping woman standing in front of her. She did not feel threatened. She felt profound amusement at the sheer blinding predictability of human greed. You really thought you were the smartest person in that penthouse, didn't you? Juliet asked, tilting her head slightly. Kylie scoffed, crossing her arms again. I was the smartest person in that penthouse. It was embarrassingly easy, Juliet. Your husband is a weak, pathetic narcissist. All I had to do was tell him he was a genius and laugh at his terrible jokes, and he handed me the keys to his life. And Constance. Kylie rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh bark of laughter. Constance was even easier. That arrogant old bat was so obsessed with status and bloodlines, she never bothered to look past my designer labels. They were so busy looking down on you, so busy analyzing your middle-class background, that they did not realize I was robbing them blind right under their overly powdered noses. I skimmed thousands off Constance's credit cards. I redirected Harrison's trust fund allowances to my private accounts. I played them like a cheap violin. Kylie leaned in close, her voice dripping with venomous pride. They thought they were untouchable royalty. But they are just shallow, superficial fools who only care about shiny things. I am a professional survivor, Juliet. I know how to extract money from arrogant idiots, and now I am extracting it from you. Pay me or I ruin the pristine reputation you need to run this company. Juliet stood in silence for a long moment, letting Kylie's desperate threats echo through the empty garage. She reached out and placed her hand on the handle of the driver's side door. You are right about one thing, Kylie, Juliet finally said, her voice calm and remarkably gentle. They are superficial fools. They judged everyone by the outward appearance of wealth and ignored the actual substance of the person. They never saw me because I did not wear the right jewelry. And they never saw you because you perfectly mirrored their own shallow greed. Juliet pulled the door handle open. But I am not Constance, and I am certainly not Harrison. I do not look at the surface. I look at the data. Juliet leaned into the front seat of her SUV. She reached across to the glove compartment, pressing the latch. She pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. She stood back up and tossed the folder directly at Kylie's chest. Kylie caught it clumsily, her brow furrowing in confusion. What is this? Open it, Juliet instructed. Kylie ripped open the flap of the folder and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs and dense legal documents. The color immediately drained from her face, leaving her skin a chalky, terrified white. Her hands began to shake violently as she flipped through the pages. The first document was a birth certificate for a woman named Amanda Clark, born in Nevada. The second was a marriage license from Florida, listing Amanda Clark and an elderly real estate developer. The third was a death certificate for that same developer, followed by a series of bank transfers draining his accounts. The subsequent pages detailed 3 different aliases, 3 different states, 3 different wealthy, vulnerable men who had been systematically isolated from their families and drained of their financial resources before their sudden, untimely deaths. Your real name is Amanda Clark, Juliet stated, her voice echoing with icy precision. Though you have also used Samantha Reynolds and Chloe Vance over the last 7 years. You are a grifter, a professional parasite. You target wealthy, entitled families, relying on their arrogance to shield you from any actual scrutiny. You thought you were running a brilliant long con on Harrison and Constance. Kylie stared at the documents, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The polished, aggressive blackmailer had vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified, trapped animal. But you got sloppy in Chicago. Amanda Juliet continued, stepping closer to the trembling woman. When you started redirecting Harrison's trust fund allowances, you used a wire transfer protocol that crossed state lines. You funneled the money through a shell corporation in Delaware before bouncing it to an offshore account in the Bahamas. That is not just simple theft, that is federal wire fraud. Juliet reached out and tapped the final document in the stack Kylie was holding. It was a printed warrant bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI has been looking for you for 3 years, Amanda Juliet said smoothly, her eyes locking onto the terrified grifter. They have an active warrant for your arrest regarding the Florida estate theft and the federal wire fraud violations. When I froze Constance's accounts and seized the holding company yesterday, I also forwarded a very detailed data packet to a senior agent at the Chicago field office. I gave them your aliases, your routing numbers, and the exact GPS coordinates of your last known location. Kylie dropped the manila folder. The heavy stack of papers scattered across the concrete floor like fallen leaves. Her designer purse slipped from her shoulder, hitting the ground with a dull thud. She looked at Juliet with absolute wide-eyed horror. "You have exactly 60 seconds to run before the agents I called arrive," Juliet stated, checking her watch with casual indifference. "They are currently pulling into the upper level of this parking structure. If you run right now, you might make it to the subway station. If you stay here and demand your severance fee, you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Kylie did not say a word. She did not attempt to grab her purse. She spun around on her expensive heels and sprinted toward the concrete exit ramp, running as fast as her trembling legs could carry her. The sound of her frantic footsteps echoed wildly through the garage, growing fainter and fainter until she vanished entirely into the shadows. Juliet watched her go. She did not smile. She simply bent down, picked up the scattered documents, and placed them back inside her vehicle. She slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine of her SUV. The holding company was secure. The family empire was dismantled. The parasites had been eradicated. It was time to go home to her children. Juliet drove out of the subterranean garage, leaving the crumbling remnants of her former life in the rearview mirror. The encounter with Kylie was merely a footnote, a brief interruption in her meticulous dismantling of the Chicago empire. Over the next 48 hours, the dust settled heavily over the city's financial district. But one significant loose end remained entirely unresolved. Constance had fled. Facing imminent federal indictments, frozen bank accounts, and a total loss of her penthouse, she had retreated to the only sanctuary she believed was completely untouchable. She had barricaded herself inside the family summer estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. It was a sprawling 20-acre compound boasting a private dock, manicured botanical gardens, and a massive mansion built to resemble a historic French chateau. Constance assumed the property was a safe haven because it had historically been insulated from her personal tax liabilities. What she failed to grasp in her blind, frantic panic was that the estate was technically owned by the overarching holding company. The very same holding company Juliet now controlled with absolute unilateral authority. The morning air was crisp and biting, as Juliet pulled her sleek black SUV up to the towering wrought iron gates of the lakefront estate. She did not come alone. 2 county sheriff cruisers idled directly behind her, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Juliet stepped out of her vehicle wearing a sharp beige trench coat over a simple black turtleneck, her posture radiating absolute unbothered calm. The local sheriff, a broad-shouldered veteran officer named Miller, walked up beside her, adjusting his heavy utility belt. He had the official eviction papers Juliet had legally filed the day before clutched tightly in his right hand. The gates were locked tight, but Juliet did not hesitate. She simply walked up to the security keypad and entered the master override code she had pulled from the holding company archives that morning. The heavy iron doors swung open smoothly, granting them total access. The convoy drove up the winding cobblestone driveway, parking directly in front of the massive oak front doors. Constance had apparently lost all touch with reality. All the heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight across the massive windows, and expensive patio furniture was piled haphazardly against the ground floor glass doors. It was a pathetic, frantic display of a ruined monarch trying to defend a fallen castle from an invading army. Sheriff Miller marched up the stone steps and pounded his fist heavily against the solid oak wood. "Constance, open this door or we will be forced to breach it," he shouted, his voice booming across the quiet estate. "You have been legally served. Open the door immediately." For a long, agonizing minute, there was only silence from inside the dark mansion. Then the heavy metallic sound of deadbolts sliding back echoed from within the foyer. The massive door creaked open slowly and Constance stood in the entryway. She looked absolutely wretched. The pristine, terrifying matriarch was completely gone. She was wearing a silk nightgown that was heavily stained with spilled red wine. Her blonde hair was a tangled, matted rat nest, and her eyes were bloodshot, swollen, and wild with manic desperation. She clutched an empty crystal glass in one hand, her knuckles white with tension. She looked past the uniformed sheriff and locked her furious eyes entirely on Juliet. The sheer, unadulterated hatred radiating from the older woman was palpable. "You," Constance snarled, her voice hoarse and broken, as she pointed a trembling finger at the driveway. "You brought the police to my home. This is my house, Juliet. I built this family. I bought these bricks. You have absolutely no right to be here." Juliet stood her ground on the front steps, entirely unfazed by the screaming. "This property is a commercial asset of the holding company," Constance Juliet stated, her voice perfectly clear and clinically detached. "It is not your home. It has never been your home. You are a squatter, and you are currently trespassing on my private property." That simple factual statement broke the very last remaining thread of Constance's sanity. She let out a feral, high-pitched screech and lunged past the sheriff, throwing her entire body weight forward. She raised her right hand, aiming a vicious, open-palmed slap directly at Juliet's face. She wanted to draw blood. She wanted to physically break the woman who had systematically dismantled her empire and stripped her of her crown. But Juliet did not flinch. She simply raised her left arm with lightning speed and caught Constance's wrist mid-air. Juliet's fingers clamped down around the older woman's frail wrist, her grip tightening like a heavy steel vice. Constance gasped in profound shock, struggling fruitlessly against Juliet's iron hold. Her wineglass shattered on the stone porch. "You ungrateful little parasite!" Constance hissed, spit flying from her lips as she struggled desperately to free her arm. "I gave you everything. I elevated you from your pathetic middle-class roots. I gave you a life of luxury and status you never could have achieved on your own. You were nothing before my son picked you out of a cubicle. You owe me your entire existence." Juliet stepped closer, twisting Constance's wrist just enough to make the older woman wince in sharp pain. She lowered her voice to a lethal whisper so incredibly cold, it seemed to drop the temperature in the grand foyer. "You did not give me anything," Constance Juliet replied, her words cutting like jagged glass. "While you were sipping martinis at the country club and playing golf in Palm Springs, I was sitting in a windowless office working 80-hour weeks. I was the one untangling the massive fraudulent web of your botched tax returns. I hid your assets. I managed your debts. I cooked the very books you ruined just to keep you and your lazy son out of federal prison for 5 years." Juliet shoved Constance's arm away forcefully, sending the older woman stumbling backward into the doorway. "I did not marry into luxury," Constance Juliet stated, her tone ringing with absolute finality. "I subsidized your delusion." Sheriff Miller stepped squarely between the two women, his hand resting firmly on his service weapon as a clear warning. "That is enough," he barked, glaring harshly at Constance. "You assault the property owner again, and I will put you in handcuffs right now. The eviction notice is active. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your personal belongings, one single bag. Then you are vacating these premises permanently. Do you understand me?" Constance backed away, her chest heaving as she looked frantically between the armed sheriff and Juliet's impassive face. The cold reality of the eviction finally pierced her manic wall of denial. She truly had nothing left. Her offshore bank accounts were frozen by the federal government. Her black cards were completely declined. The federal agents in Chicago were undoubtedly drafting her arrest warrant as they spoke. She needed cash to run. She needed her emergency stash to secure a private flight out of the country. "Wait," Constance stammered, her eyes darting wildly toward the dark hallway leading to the back of the house. "Fine, I will pack my bag. Just let me get my personal things from the study." The sheriff nodded, gesturing impatiently for her to hurry. Constance turned and ran down the polished hallway, her bare feet slapping loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. She scrambled into the dark mahogany study, slamming the heavy oak door shut behind her. She did not even bother turning on the overhead lights. She rushed directly toward the large antique oil painting hanging securely behind the massive executive desk. She grabbed the heavy gold frame and tore the painting off the wall, letting it crash violently to the floor. Behind it sat a heavy steel digital wall safe, embedded deep into the masonry. This was her absolute last resort. For years, she had kept a secret fortune in untraceable bearer bonds and thick stacks of $100 bills locked inside for exactly this kind of apocalyptic emergency. It was more than enough money to secure a new identity and disappear to a country without an extradition treaty. Her hands shook violently as she punched in the 6-digit biometric passcode. The small digital keypad beeped green, indicating a successful entry. Constance grabbed the heavy steel handle and ripped the safe door open, a hysterical, guttural sob of pure relief escaping her tight throat. But the sob instantly died, turning into a gasp of pure horror. The safe was completely empty. There were no untraceable bearer bonds. There were no stacks of $100 bills. The metal shelves were entirely stripped bare, wiped completely clean of her salvation. Constance dropped to her knees, staring into the dark, empty void of the steel box. The only thing sitting in the dead center of the cold metal shelf was a single piece of heavy monogrammed stationery. Constance reached in with a trembling, violently shaking hand and picked up the paper. It was a handwritten note scrawled in messy, arrogant handwriting she recognized instantly. It was not from Juliet. It was not from the federal authorities. It was from her son Harrison. The GPS tracker embedded deep within the lining of the heavy canvas duffel bag blinked a steady bright green on the encrypted tablet resting in Juliet's lap. She sat quietly in the spacious back seat of her armored black SUV, watching the small digital dot move rapidly away from the Chicago city limits. Harrison had always been entirely predictable. He lacked the basic intellectual imagination required to execute a truly original escape plan. When he emptied Constance's hidden wall safe at the lakefront estate, he unknowingly triggered a silent alert Juliet had strategically installed weeks ago. She knew he would eventually run. She knew he would eagerly steal from his own mother the exact moment the holding company funds were frozen by her corporate takeover. He was a fundamental coward who survived his entire life by cannibalizing the people closest to him and hiding behind their power. Juliet had specifically designed this trap. She had meticulously ensured that the only remaining liquid capital in the entire family portfolio was locked inside that specific wall safe. She had effectively herded her husband into committing grand larceny, knowing the federal authorities would eagerly take the bait. The heavy SUV turned sharply off the main interstate highway, gliding onto a narrow, unmarked asphalt road that cut deeply into a dense forest of towering pine trees. The heavy morning rain had finally stopped, but a thick, damp fog hung low in the frigid air, clinging to the dark branches and completely obscuring the horizon. It was a bleak, desolate landscape that perfectly mirrored the crumbling remnants of the family empire. At the very end of the secluded road sat a small private airstrip. It was a highly discreet, unlisted facility used exclusively by wealthy executives and corrupt politicians who desperately wished to bypass the intense scrutiny of commercial airport security. A single twin-engine chartered Gulfstream jet sat idling on the cracked tarmac, its sleek white fuselage looking stark and ghostly against the gloomy gray backdrop of the heavy, overcast sky. It was an aircraft fully capable of reaching a non-extradition country without requiring a single fuel stop, or so Harrison foolishly believed. Harrison paced frantically near the bottom of the aircraft's aluminum stairs. He clutched the massive, bulging canvas duffel bag tightly to his chest, as if it were a life preserver in a raging ocean. He looked absolutely terrible. The pristine, arrogant prince of Chicago real estate was completely gone. His usually perfectly styled hair was plastered flat against his forehead with a thick layer of cold, nervous sweat. His expensive, tailored cashmere coat was heavily wrinkled and smeared with dark mud from his frantic, chaotic escape through the Wisconsin woods. He constantly checked his heavy gold Rolex, muttering angry, desperate curses to himself and kicking violently at the wet asphalt. He was waiting for the pilot, waiting for the final mechanical clearance to flee the country and permanently abandon the smoldering ruins of his family legacy. Juliet's SUV glided silently out of the heavy fog, pulling to a smooth, calculated stop directly between Harrison and the waiting jet. Harrison froze instantly. His eyes went wide with sheer animalistic panic. He took a clumsy, stumbling step backward, gripping the heavy bag of stolen cash and bearer bonds so tightly his knuckles turned a mottled, ghostly white. He looked frantically to his left and right, desperately searching for an exit route, but two massive private security contractors stepped out of the front doors of the SUV, effectively blocking his only path to the tree line. Juliet opened the heavy rear door and stepped out onto the damp pavement. She slowly buttoned her crimson coat against the biting chill, her expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. She walked deliberately toward him, her high heels clicking a steady rhythmic cadence against the tarmac that seemed to magnify Harrison's rapidly rising terror. She did not rush. She moved with the undeniable authority of a woman who held every single card in the deck. Harrison stared at her, his chest heaving visibly beneath his ruined coat. Then, like a mechanical switch being flipped, his sheer panic melted into a pathetic, highly rehearsed performance. The vicious, arrogant bully vanished instantly, replaced by a whimpering, helpless victim. He dropped the heavy duffel bag onto the tarmac with a dull thud and held his trembling hands up in a dramatic gesture of total surrender. "Juliet, please, you have to listen to me," Harrison pleaded, his voice cracking artificially as he took a tentative, cautious step forward. "This is not what it looks like. I swear to you. I am not running from you, Juliet. I am running from her." He pointed a shaking finger in the general direction of the city, blaming the woman he had just robbed blind. "My mother destroyed us, Juliet. She is an absolute monster. You saw what she did. You saw the horrific contracts she tried to force you to sign. She manipulated my entire life from the moment I was born. Every mistake I ever made was because of her toxic, suffocating control. She pushed Kylie into my life. She explicitly orchestrated that entire affair to drive a permanent wedge between us because she was deeply threatened by your brilliance. I never wanted a divorce. I never wanted to leave you. She forced my hand, Juliet. She threatened to cut me off completely and leave me with absolutely nothing if I did not follow her precise, vicious orders. I was a hostage in my own family." Juliet stopped a few feet away from him. She did not interrupt his frantic monologue. She did not offer a single nod of understanding. She simply let him dig his own grave with his pathetic, cowardly excuses. "I grabbed this money so we could start over." Harrison continued, his words tumbling out in a rapid, desperate rush. He gestured wildly to the heavy canvas bag resting by his expensive shoes. "There is almost $20 million in untraceable bearer bonds and sequential $100 bills in that bag, Juliet. We can take this chartered plane right now. We can fly to a secure jurisdiction far away from the American courts. We can send for the twins once we are safe. We can be a real family far away from Constance's poison and the holding company drama. I was doing this for us, Juliet. I took this incredible risk to save our marriage. Please believe me." Juliet looked at the man she had once vowed to spend her natural life with. She felt no lingering anger. She felt no residual sorrow or heartbreak. She felt nothing but a profound clinical disgust. Harrison stood before her, offering a spectacular masterclass in narcissistic deflection. He took absolutely zero accountability for his own atrocious actions. He did not apologize for abandoning his premature newborn infants in a sterile hospital room while they fought for their lives. He did not express a single ounce of remorse for parading a shallow grifter through his luxury penthouse while his wife was recovering from emergency surgery. He simply shifted the entire burden of his immense guilt onto the very woman he had just robbed. He had learned absolutely nothing from the catastrophic collapse of his privileged world. He was fundamentally broken, utterly incapable of being a loyal husband, and structurally unfit to ever be a father to their children. He was a hollow, empty vessel, driven entirely by sheer entitlement and cowardice. Harrison saw the flat, icy indifference in Juliet's staring eyes and realized with sudden, sinking horror that his dramatic performance was completely failing. His mask of tearful contrition hardened instantly, snapping back into a dark sneer of desperate, arrogant impatience. He bent down, grunting loudly, and hoisted the heavy canvas duffel bag back onto his right shoulder. "Fine." Harrison spat, his voice laced with bitter venom, as he took an aggressive step toward the aluminum stairs of the aircraft. "You want to stay here and play the untouchable corporate queen, then go right ahead and freeze. You can keep the damn holding company. You can keep the massive empty skyscrapers and deal with the relentless headaches of the federal investigators. I do not care anymore, Juliet. I am taking this bag and I am getting on this plane. You get your stolen empire and I get my freedom. We both win today. Harrison turned his back on her entirely, placing his muddy shoe on the first metal rung of the boarding stairs. He looked up at the closed cabin door, waiting impatiently for the pilot to open the hatch and welcome him aboard his escape vessel. Juliet did not move to physically stop him. She simply reached deep into the pocket of her crimson trench coat and pulled out a heavy black tactical two-way radio. She pressed the side transmission button, raising the device slowly to her mouth. "The jet isn't fueled!" "Harrison," Juliet announced, her voice carrying a lethal, undeniable finality across the quiet, damp tarmac. "It's grounded." Harrison froze his body, locking rigidly in place with his foot suspended heavily on the metal stair. He slowly turned his head, looking back over his shoulder at her with wide, completely terrified eyes. A harsh, piercing wail suddenly shattered the quiet morning air. Sirens. Multiple heavy sirens blaring aggressively in the far distance, growing significantly louder and far more frantic with every passing second. The flashing red and blue strobe lights began to cut violently through the thick white fog at the edge of the dense tree line, illuminating the dark asphalt road. "And those aren't local cops," Juliet said, lowering the radio and looking directly into his horrified, panicked eyes. "The feds are waiting at the front gate." The wailing of the sirens grew deafening, a mechanical scream bouncing off the dense, towering pine trees and reverberating against the metal fuselage of the grounded jet. Through the thick, swirling morning fog, the harsh strobe of red and blue lights illuminated the private runway in a chaotic, disorienting rhythm. A convoy of heavily armored black SUVs had just smashed through the main security gate of the isolated airstrip and was now tearing down the narrow access road, heading directly toward the tarmac. Harrison watched the approaching federal vehicles, his jaw hanging slack, his entire body going completely rigid. The heavy canvas duffel bag stuffed with millions of dollars in stolen cash slipped entirely from his numb grasp. It hit the wet asphalt with a heavy, muted thud, a useless pile of fabric and paper. The money, his ultimate escape plan, his ticket to a new life of sunny impunity, no longer mattered. The physical, terrifying reality of a federal penitentiary was barreling toward him at 60 miles an hour. His knees buckled beneath him. The pristine, arrogant heir to the Chicago real estate empire, a man who had spent his entire life looking down on everyone else, literally collapsed onto the damp tarmac. He landed hard, the rough, wet asphalt tearing the fabric of his expensive tailored trousers and scraping the skin of his knees, but he did not even seem to register the physical pain. His breathing became erratic, coming in short, panicked, hyperventilating gasps. He looked up at Juliet, his face completely devoid of color, his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His eyes were wide with a pathetic, infantile terror that completely stripped away his handsome, curated facade. "Please," Harrison whimpered, reaching out a trembling hand to grasp the hem of her crimson trench coat. He was shaking violently, his teeth practically chattering in the cold, damp morning air. "Please, Juliet. You cannot let them take me. You have the power to stop this. You control the holding company now. You own everything. You can tell them it was all a misunderstanding. You can tell them Constance acted entirely alone. I was just following her orders. You can protect me." Juliet took a deliberate, measured step backward, smoothly pulling her coat out of his grasping, desperate reach. She looked down at him, her face a mask of absolute glacial indifference. She watched him grovel in the mud, observing the complete, spectacular destruction of his ego with the detached interest of a scientist. Harrison realized his frantic pleas for his own sake were failing completely. His mind, conditioned by a lifetime of using other people, scrambled for a new tactic, a new angle of emotional manipulation. He immediately pivoted to the only leverage he believed he had left to exploit. "Think about the twins," Harrison cried out, his voice cracking loudly, fighting to be heard over the rapidly approaching sirens. He clutched his hands together in a gesture of frantic, desperate begging, looking up at her from the wet pavement. You cannot let our children grow up knowing their father is a convicted felon. Think about what that will do to their lives, Juliet. Think about the public shame, the brutal, relentless media circus. They will carry that ugly stigma for the rest of their lives. They will be ruined by this. You have to save me for them. Do it for the twins. Please, I am their father. You cannot take their father away from them. I will change, I swear to you. Just make this stop. He looked up at her, tears actively streaming down his face, playing the role of the devoted, terrified family man with every ounce of theatrical desperation he could muster. He waited for the maternal guilt to wash over her, fully expecting her cold demeanor to finally crack at the mention of their infant children. Juliet stared down at him with a level of disgust so profound it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the damp, frigid air. She did not soften. She did not waver. The mention of the twins did not break her resolve, it only fueled the absolute certainty of her actions. She looked at him as if he were a poisonous insect writhing on the pavement, something that needed to be permanently removed for the safety of everyone around it. "You do not care about being a father, Harrison," Juliet said, her voice cutting through the wail of the sirens with lethal, icy precision. "You care exclusively about saving your own skin. You have always cared entirely and only about yourself. Do not ever invoke my children to justify your cowardice." Harrison shook his head frantically in denial, opening his mouth to launch into another pathetic defense. But Juliet raised her hand, a sharp, commanding gesture that silenced him instantly. "Do you remember the night Constance threw her lavish $1 million charity gala at the Natural History Museum?" Juliet asked, her tone entirely conversational but dripping with a toxic, heavy venom. "The night I was stuck in the neonatal intensive care unit with a raging infection, sitting in a plastic chair, watching our premature babies fight for every single breath inside those incubators. You told me you had to attend the gala to manage critical corporate client relations. You looked me right in the eye and told me it was a business necessity to secure our family future." Harrison swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. His eyes darted nervously toward the approaching federal vehicles now tearing across the far side of the runway, then darted back to Juliet. "I accessed the security feeds from your private executive suite that night." Juliet continued, taking a slow, menacing step closer, so her shadow fell completely over his kneeling, trembling form. "I bypassed your pathetic security protocols and listened to the unredacted audio recording of your private conversation with your mother. You were not discussing client relations, Harrison. You were discussing me. And you were discussing my children." Harrison opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of lie, but no words came out. His breath hitched in his chest. "I heard you, Harrison," Juliet stated, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "I heard every single word. I heard you call my beautiful, fragile babies props. You sat in your leather chair drinking expensive scotch, and you told Constance that as soon as the media attention surrounding their birth died down, you were going to ship them off to a Swiss boarding school because you could not stand the sound of their crying. You negotiated their entire childhoods like a hostile corporate merger. You explicitly agreed to use them as leverage to keep me quiet and compliant, and then you planned to discard them the exact moment they became inconvenient to your lifestyle." She leaned down, bringing her face inches from his, forcing him to look directly into her eyes. "You lost the right to use my children as your human shields the day you tried to sell them." Juliet whispered the words, carrying the weight of a physical blow. The convoy of black SUVs slammed to a violent halt at the absolute edge of the tarmac, their heavy doors swinging open in chaotic unison. A dozen armed federal agents began pouring out into the fog, shouting tactical orders to one another, and rapidly forming a perimeter around the grounded aircraft. Juliet straightened up, ignoring the encroaching authorities entirely. She calmly reached into her designer briefcase and pulled out a sleek, heavy leather-bound document. She flipped the thick pages open to the final signature line and retrieved a heavy silver fountain pen from her inner coat pocket. She held the document out, extending it directly toward Harrison's trembling, muddy hands. "This is a full, irrevocable termination of your parental rights," Juliet announced, her voice rising clearly and steadily over the chaotic noise of the FBI agents deploying across the wet runway. It permanently strips you of all legal, physical, and financial rights to my son and daughter. You will never see them again. You will never speak to them again. You will effectively cease to exist in their lives as of this exact second. You will be a ghost. Harrison stared at the thick legal document, his eyes wide with profound horror and total confusion. His mind could barely process the words she was saying. "Why would I sign that?" he stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic squeak. "I am not signing away my kids." Because Juliet replied, reaching into her pocket again. She pulled out a small, encrypted black flash drive, holding it up delicately between her manicured fingers. "This drive contains your personal, unredacted offshore ledger. It meticulously details every single illegal wire transfer, every fraudulent shell corporation, every single dime you systematically stole from your own holding company over the last 5 years. It is the absolute smoking gun that will guarantee you spend the next 2 decades rotting in a federal prison." Juliet looked past him at the federal agents, who were now jogging deliberately across the tarmac, closing the final distance toward them, their weapons drawn and lowered at the ready. She looked back down at her ruined husband. "Sign away all rights to the twins forever." Juliet ordered, her gaze locked intensely on Harrison's panicked, sweat-slicked face. "If you sign this document right now, I won't hand your personal ledger to the FBI waiting at the gate. They are going to arrest Constance. They are going to seize all the remaining corporate assets. But without this specific encrypted drive, they do not have the hard, irrefutable evidence to personally indict you for the offshore wire fraud. You will be completely broke, Harrison. You will have absolutely nothing left to your name. But you will be a free man." The choice hung in this frigid, damp air, incredibly heavy and completely absolute. Harrison looked down at the heavy canvas bag of stolen cash sitting uselessly on the wet asphalt, a vivid reminder of his failed escape. He looked over his shoulder at the rapidly approaching federal agents, their tactical vests visible through the fog. And finally, he looked back at the leather-bound document in Juliet's outstretched hand, the silver pen gleaming in the dull morning light. He was completely cornered. His mother was destroyed, his massive generational wealth was entirely gone, and his physical freedom was evaporating by the millisecond. Juliet had perfectly engineered a flawless scenario where his inherent, overwhelming selfishness was his only remaining survival tactic. He had to make an immediate, permanent, binding choice between fighting for the children he never actually wanted or saving himself from the horrifying, impending reality of a federal penitentiary. The heavy oak door swung shut, muffling the pathetic, wretched sobs echoing against the bathroom tiles. Juliet stood in the polished marble corridor of the federal courthouse, inhaling a deep breath of the sterile, conditioned air. The scent of fear and cheap institutional bleach faded, replaced by the crisp, undeniable clarity of total victory. She adjusted the strap of her leather tote, feeling the solid weight of the termination papers Harrison had frantically signed just hours ago. The twin pillars of the Chicago real estate empire had been systematically broken, humiliated, and permanently removed from her children's future. She walked past the female court officer who was already moving toward the restroom to retrieve the fallen matriarch. Juliet did not break her stride. She moved with the fluid, unbothered grace of a woman who had meticulously burned an entire toxic legacy to the ground and emerged from the ashes completely unscathed. As she pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and stepped out onto the bustling Chicago street, the biting wind whipped her hair across her face. The holding company was hers. The assets were secure. The parasites had been eradicated. She raised her hand, signaling her waiting driver. It was time to go home, to walk into the nursery and finally introduce her son and daughter to a world where they would never be treated as commodities. But as the sleek black SUV merged smoothly into the downtown traffic, Juliet's encrypted tablet chimed sharply from inside her bag. It was a high-priority alert from the holding company's internal security network. She pulled the tablet out, unlocking the screen with a quick swipe. The message was from the lead forensic auditor she had personally installed to monitor the family's deepest, most heavily guarded trust accounts. Juliet's eyes narrowed as she read the brief, alarming text. "Emergency override triggered. Master Trust Account 001 accessed via Legacy Analog Protocol. Massive capital withdrawal initiated." Juliet stared at the screen, her clinical detachment vanishing instantly. Account double. O1 was the origin account, the bedrock financial foundation established by Harrison's grandfather 50 years ago. It was supposed to be completely frozen, locked behind layers of biometric security and digital firewalls that Juliet herself had coded. But someone had bypassed the digital network entirely using an obsolete paper-based analog protocol that predated the modern banking system. And they were currently draining $40 million in liquid assets. Juliet tapped the screen rapidly, bringing up the physical location of the analog withdrawal. It was not a bank branch. It was not an offshore wire hub. The coordinates pointed directly to the sub-basement of the very building Juliet had just seized, the holding company's primary corporate headquarters. She leaned forward, tapping the glass partition separating her from the driver. "Turn the car around," Juliet ordered, her voice laced with sudden sharp urgency. "Get me back to the tower right now." The SUV executed a sharp, aggressive U-turn, tires squealing against the asphalt as it sped back toward the financial district. Juliet's mind raced through the possibilities. Constance was in federal custody. Harrison was a hunted fugitive fleeing through the Wisconsin woods. Kylie had been terrified into exile by the FBI. There was no one left. Every known threat had been neutralized. 10 minutes later, the SUV slid into the corporate loading dock. Juliet bypassed the main lobby using her executive keycard to access the restricted service elevator. She pressed the button for the sub-basement, a forgotten archival level primarily used for storing decades-old paper records and outdated server hardware. The elevator doors parted with a sluggish, heavy groan. The sub-basement was poorly lit, smelling of dust and aging paper. Juliet stepped out, her heels clicking softly against the concrete floor. She followed the soft, rhythmic hum of an active terminal coming from the deepest corner of the archives. She turned the corner, stepping into the glow of a single flickering overhead light. Sitting at a heavy vintage security terminal, calmly typing authorization codes into a massive, outdated mainframe, was a man wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. He did not look rushed. He did not look panicked. He looked entirely at home in the dusty archives. Juliet froze, her breath catching sharply in her throat. The man finished typing a long sequence of numbers, hit the enter key, and slowly spun his chair around to face her. "Hello, Juliet," he said, his voice rich, warm, and entirely composed. "You have been incredibly busy this week. I must say your hostile takeover was a masterpiece of corporate warfare." Juliet stared at the man, her analytical mind struggling to process the impossible visual information in front of her. She recognized the sharp jawline, the piercing blue eyes, and the arrogant, relaxed posture from the massive oil painting that hung in the main boardroom upstairs. It was Arthur, Harrison's father, the legendary founder of the empire, the man who had supposedly died in a tragic boating accident 15 years ago. "You are dead," Juliet stated, her voice tight with disbelief, though her eyes remained locked on the very living, breathing man sitting before her. Arthur offered a soft, entirely pleasant chuckle. "Death is a highly subjective concept when you control enough offshore capital, Juliet. Let us just say I required a permanent, indisputable exit strategy to avoid a rather messy federal investigation of my own." Constance played the grieving widow perfectly. It was the best performance of her life. He stood up, brushing a speck of dust from his pristine lapel. "I have been monitoring the company from a very comfortable distance for a decade and a half," Arthur explained, stepping away from the terminal. "I let Constance run the show because her massive ego made her highly predictable. I let Harrison pretend to be an executive because his incompetence made him an excellent shield. But I always maintained the master analog override for the origin accounts, just in case my foolish wife and my pathetic son ever managed to sink the ship." Arthur gestured toward the glowing screen of the terminal. "The transfer is complete, Juliet. $40 million safely secured in an untraceable account that you cannot reach." Juliet's shock instantly transformed into cold, calculating fury. She stepped forward, squaring her shoulders. "You are not walking out of this building with that money, Arthur. I control the security grid. I can lock down this entire facility with a single command. The feds are already swarming your family. You are a dead man walking into a federal trap." Arthur smiled, a chilling, deeply predatory expression that made Harrison's arrogance look like child's play. "You misunderstand the situation," Juliet, Arthur said, reaching into the inner pocket of his navy suit. "I am not running from the feds. I am not a frantic, sloppy amateur like my son. I built this empire. I know exactly how to dismantle it." He pulled a small, heavy silver remote from his pocket. It had a single shielded red button. "You were so focused on the digital architecture of the holding company that you completely ignored the physical infrastructure," Arthur said, his tone dropping to a dark, menacing whisper. "When I built this tower, I ensured I would always have a final, absolute failsafe. There are incendiary charges wired into the main structural supports of the primary data center 3 floors above us." Juliet's eyes darted to the remote in his hand, a sudden wave of genuine dread washing over her. "If you attempt to stop me, if you alert your security team, or if you try to trace that $40 million, Arthur continued, his thumb hovering directly over the red button, "I will detonate the charges. The resulting fire will destroy the primary servers, the backup drives, and every single piece of digital evidence you just used to take down Constance and Harrison. The feds will have absolutely nothing to prosecute. The entire corporate structure will collapse into chaos, and your ironclad leverage will literally go up in smoke." He took a slow, deliberate step toward the service elevator. "You played a brilliant game against my wife and my son, Juliet," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto hers with lethal intensity. "But you are playing against the house now, and the house always wins." Arthur stepped into the elevator, holding the remote up as a silent, terrifying warning. The doors began to slide shut. "You have a choice to make," Juliet, Arthur said, his voice echoing in the narrow shaft. "You can try to be a hero and lose everything you just fought for. Or you can let me walk away with my 40 million, keep the rest of the empire, and go home to those beautiful twins of yours. Choose wisely." The heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing the dead patriarch inside, and leaving Juliet standing alone in the dusty sub-basement, staring at the flashing green light of the analog terminal. The empire was not secure. The true architect had returned from the grave, and the real war had just begun. The autumn air had given way to a bitter, freezing Chicago winter, stripping the trees bare and turning the sky the color of bruised iron. 7 months had completely evaporated since the sterile, damp marble of the courthouse bathroom was permanently replaced by the heavy, imposing oak paneling of Federal Courtroom Number 4. Juliet sat in the second row of the public gallery, her posture immaculate, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. She was no longer the frightened, pregnant woman fighting for her life in a hospital bed, nor was she the desperate accountant scrambling to cover up the malicious financial crimes of her in-laws. She was the sole, undisputed master of her own reality, sitting in silent witness to the final spectacular collapse of the woman who had tried to destroy her. Constance sat at the defense table, a hollow, shivering ghost of the terrifying matriarch she had once been. Without Juliet's brilliant, meticulous financial protection, the walls had closed in with breathtaking speed. Without the massive holding company funds to secure elite, aggressive legal representation, Constance had been relegated to a severely overworked, utterly exhausted public defender who barely looked up from his legal pad. Her expensive tailored suits had been replaced by a drab, ill-fitting beige blouse. Her platinum hair, once sprayed and styled into an immovable helmet of status, hung limp and graying around her sunken, exhausted face. She was entirely stripped of her pride, her power, and her blinding delusions of superiority. The federal judge presiding over the case was a stern, uncompromising man with zero tolerance for the aggressive entitlement of white-collar criminals. He adjusted his reading glasses, staring down from his elevated bench at the ruined woman cowering before him. The courtroom was dead silent, the air thick with the heavy, undeniable weight of impending justice. "Constance." The judge began, his voice booming across the polished wood and echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "Over the past 3 weeks, this court has reviewed a mountain of financial evidence. We have seen the offshore accounts, the blatant tax evasion, the systemic decades-long manipulation of corporate assets. You believed your wealth elevated you above the fundamental laws of this nation. You operated under the deeply flawed assumption that accountability was a burden reserved entirely for the lower classes. The judge paused, leaning forward and resting his clasped hands on the mahogany bench. His eyes locked onto Constance with a piercing, absolute disgust. I have presided over financial crimes for 2 decades, the judge continued, his tone dropping to a sharp, lethal register. I have seen greed in every conceivable form, but the sheer breathtaking malice of your actions extends far beyond simple tax evasion. The prosecution entered a specific piece of evidence into the public record that fundamentally and perfectly illustrates your complete and total lack of moral character. It was a contract, a legally binding document that you personally carried into a maternity ward. Constance flinched violently, closing her eyes as if struck by a physical blow, but the judge showed absolutely zero mercy. He raised a copy of the very contract Juliet had rewritten, holding it up for the entire courtroom to see. You walked into a hospital room where a young mother was recovering from a traumatic emergency surgery. The judge stated, his voice ringing with righteous, unfiltered anger. You threw a $25 million offer onto her hospital bed. You attempted to use your vast, corrupt financial resources to legally purchase human beings. You tried to buy your own newborn grandchildren and force their mother into permanent exile. Your arrogance completely blinded you to the very laws you thought your money could effortlessly circumvent. You genuinely believed you could put a price tag on flesh and blood. You priced out your own humanity a very long time ago, Constance, and today you are finally going to pay the ultimate deficit. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the gallery. Juliet did not move a single muscle. She listened to the judge articulate the exact horror she had endured, feeling a profound, quiet satisfaction washing through her veins. The monster was finally being dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light. It is the judgment of this court, the judge announced, raising his wooden gavel, that you be remanded immediately to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. It was over. Constance let out a weak, pathetic gasp, her knees buckling slightly as the public defender stepped away from her, abandoning her to her fate. 2 massive federal marshals stepped forward instantly. They grabbed Constance by her frail arms, turning her around. The cold, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists cut through the silent room. She was no longer a socialite, she was a federal inmate. As the marshals dragged her roughly toward the side exit, Constance dragged her feet, turning her head to look back into the gallery. She frantically scanned the wooden benches until her desperate, bloodshot eyes locked onto Juliet. Constance expected to see a smug, gloating smile. She expected to see a triumphant sneer, some final petty display of victory from the woman she had tormented. Instead, Juliet gave her absolutely nothing. Juliet's face remained a perfect, impenetrable mask of serene, glacial indifference. She looked at Constance not as a defeated rival, but as a total stranger. She looked right through the sobbing, handcuffed woman, proving in one final, devastating glance that Constance did not even matter enough to be hated anymore. The matriarch let out a broken, gut-wrenching sob as the heavy wooden doors of the holding cell slammed shut, swallowing her into the darkness forever. While Constance was being marched into a concrete federal holding cell, Harrison was 100 miles away, experiencing his own highly personalized, inescapable version of absolute misery. He had fled the state the moment he signed away his parental rights, terrified that Juliet would unleash the FBI if he lingered a second too long. Without his mother's stolen emergency cash and permanently severed from his massive trust fund, Harrison had crashed into the brutal, unforgiving reality of the real world. He was currently living in a cramped, dilapidated studio apartment on the outskirts of a dying industrial town in Ohio. The ceiling was stained with yellow water damage, and the peeling linoleum floor perpetually smelled of stale beer and cheap bleach. He was no longer wearing custom-tailored Italian suits or drinking expensive imported scotch on a penthouse balcony. He was wearing a stiff, incredibly uncomfortable polyester uniform, bearing the bright neon logo of a discount auto parts store. Stripped of his wealth, his powerful surname, and his mother's suffocating protection, Harrison had quickly discovered that he possessed absolutely zero marketable skills. He had never worked an honest day in his entire life. He was entirely incapable of functioning without a massive financial safety net. He was currently standing behind a scuffed laminate checkout counter, gripping a damp, filthy rag. His hands, once soft and perfectly manicured, were now dry, cracked, and covered in small, painful calluses. He scrubbed furiously at a sticky, spilled puddle of motor oil on the counter, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. A rude, impatient customer yelled at him for moving too slowly, and Harrison simply swallowed his boiling, toxic pride, muttering a pathetic apology. He was a cornered, broken animal trapped in a cage of his own making. He had eagerly signed away his own children to save his own skin, avoiding federal prison, only to condemn himself to a lifetime of grueling, monotonous minimum-wage servitude. He was completely alone, entirely forgotten, and forced to survive on his own utter lack of merit. Back in Chicago, Juliet rose gracefully from her wooden bench in the gallery. She smoothed the fabric of her charcoal suit and turned her back on the empty defense table. She walked down the center aisle, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the polished marble floor. She pushed through the heavy double doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the bright, brilliant sunshine of the courthouse plaza. The air outside was fresh, clean, and entirely devoid of the toxic, suffocating influence of the family she had just buried. Standing by the massive stone pillars of the courthouse entrance was her personal attorney, Richard. He was a sharp, brilliant legal mind who had orchestrated the final fatal blows against the holding company with flawless precision. He wore a crisp navy suit and held a sleek, heavy leather-bound document folio clutched securely against his chest. When he saw Juliet approaching, Richard offered a warm, deeply respectful smile. He stepped forward, opening the leather folio and holding it out toward her. "It is done, Juliet," Richard said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. The judge expedited the final petition. "Everything is official." Juliet stopped by the stone column, the warm afternoon sun washing over her face. She looked down at the crisp, heavy parchment paper resting inside the leather folio. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her silver fountain pen. She unscrewed the cap, her eyes scanning the dense legal text until she found the final designated signature line at the very bottom of the page. It was a petition for a legal name change. A complete, irrevocable severing of ties. Juliet pressed the silver nib of the pen against the paper. She did not hesitate. She signed her name with bold, sweeping strokes, finalizing the legal order that completely stripped Harrison's arrogant surname from her children's birth certificates. She had successfully and permanently changed the twins' last names back to her own maiden name. They would never carry the heavy, corrupt burden of their father's cowardly legacy. They would never be associated with the horrific, malicious greed of their grandmother. The toxic, suffocating legacy of the Chicago Empire was officially and entirely erased from her children's future. Juliet capped her pen, handed the folio back to Richard, and walked down the courthouse steps, stepping into a brand new world that belonged entirely to her. The biting Chicago winter had surrendered to a brilliant, crisp autumn. The financial district hummed with its usual frantic morning energy, but Juliet navigated the crowded pavement with the effortless grace of a woman who owned the very concrete beneath her feet. She stepped through the heavy glass doors of a high-end artisanal coffee shop located just 3 blocks from the holding company headquarters. She was the undisputed chief executive officer now. She had spent the last 12 months meticulously dismantling the corrupt infrastructure Constance had built, purging the board of loyalists, and restructuring the entire portfolio into a fortress of legitimate, highly profitable enterprises. The empire was clean, and it answered solely to her. Juliet stood near the pickup counter, checking a quarterly earnings report on her phone. She wore a tailored ivory suit that projected an aura of untouchable authority, her presence commanding the subtle respect of everyone around her. The bustling noise of the cafe faded into a low hum as a barista called out her order. A tall oat milk latte for Juliet. The voice was hoarse, carrying a distinct ragged edge of profound exhaustion. Juliet locked her phone and stepped forward, reaching for the cardboard cup. Her eyes drifted upward, meeting the gaze of the man behind the counter. Harrison froze. The stainless steel milk steaming pitcher slipped from his trembling hand, clattering loudly into the industrial sink. The spectacular, arrogant prince of Chicago real estate was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, prematurely aging man swallowed whole by the relentless grinding machinery of the working-class life he had spent his entire existence mocking. He wore a faded, ill-fitting green polo shirt and a dark apron heavily stained with coffee grounds and dried syrup. His once perfectly styled hair was thinning and unkempt, his face lined with the deep, permanent grooves of stress and chronic sleep deprivation. He looked like a man who had spent the last year fighting simply to survive the week, a man who had finally learned the terrifying true cost of rent and groceries. Juliet Harrison breathed the name, catching in his throat like a jagged piece of glass. He stared at her, his bloodshot eyes sweeping over her immaculate designer suit, the glowing health in her face, the absolute serene power she radiated. He took a clumsy step forward, pressing his chest against the pastry case, his hands gripping the metal edge so tightly his knuckles turned a mottled white. "Juliet, please," he stammered, his voice dropping to a desperate, frantic whisper as the other patrons began to stare. "I am so sorry. I think about you every single day. I think about what I did. I was a coward. I was so terrified of Constance and the money and losing everything that I lost my mind. You have to believe me, Juliet. The money poisoned me. It poisoned our whole family. Do you remember how we were when we first met? Before the holding company took over our lives? We were happy, Juliet. We were just a normal couple in love." Juliet did not blink. She did not frown. She did not offer a single micro-expression of anger, pity, or sorrow. She looked at the man who had abandoned her in a hospital room, who had plotted to sell their infant children, who had actively participated in a conspiracy to destroy her life. She looked at him with the mild, detached curiosity one might reserve for a smudge of dirt on a window pane. "Tell me about the kids." Harrison pleaded, a single pathetic tear escaping his eye and cutting a clean track through the fine layer of coffee dust on his cheek. "Please, Juliet, just tell me how my son and daughter are doing. Are they walking? Are they talking? Do they look like me? Just give me a picture. Juliet, please. I have nothing. I am working double shifts just to keep the lights on in a terrible apartment. I have absolutely nothing left." The silence that stretched between them was absolute and devastating. Juliet did not argue. She did not raise her voice to berate him. She did not lean in to deliver a cutting remark about the choices he had made or the consequences he was finally suffering. She simply reached out with a steady, perfectly manicured hand and picked up her latte. She pulled a crisp $50 bill from her purse and dropped it lightly into the plastic tip jar resting on the counter. The money fluttered softly, landing against a pile of crumpled singles. She turned her back on him and walked toward the exit without uttering a single syllable. The sheer profound weight of her silence hit Harrison harder than a physical blow. A screaming argument would have given him closure. A bitter insult would have given him something to push back against. But her absolute total indifference proved the most terrifying reality of all. He did not matter. He was completely irrelevant. He had been entirely erased from her universe. Harrison slumped forward against the counter, burying his face in his rough, calloused hands, as a fresh wave of patrons pushed past him demanding their morning coffee. Juliet pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the brilliant morning sunshine. Her chauffeured car was idling smoothly at the curb. The driver immediately stepped out, opening the heavy armored door for her. She slid into the plush leather seat, taking a calm, deliberate sip of her latte as the car merged seamlessly into the flow of downtown traffic. She felt no lingering adrenaline, no residual anxiety. The ghost of her past had tried to haunt her, and she had simply walked right through it. The city skyline gradually gave way to the sprawling, lush green suburbs of the North Shore. The car turned off the main highway, gliding down a private, tree-lined avenue before passing through the towering wrought iron gates of Juliet's newly acquired estate. The property was a masterpiece of architectural elegance, completely secluded from the prying eyes of the city, surrounded by acres of vibrant ancient oak trees and immaculately manicured gardens. It was a fortress of peace, built entirely on her own terms. Juliet stepped out of the car and walked around to the expansive sunlit backyard. The air was filled with the joyous musical sound of genuine laughter. Today was a celebration. It was the twins' first birthday party, and the garden had been transformed into a magical wonderland of pastel balloons, soft music, and tables laden with incredible food. But the true beauty of the afternoon was not in the expensive decorations. It was in the people who filled the space. Juliet walked across the manicured lawn, greeting her guests with genuine warm smiles. There were no toxic socialites sizing each other up. There were no corrupt executives plotting corporate sabotage in the corners. The garden was filled with loyal friends, trusted colleagues, and the chosen family that had stood by her through the darkest fires of the past 2 years. Richard, her brilliant attorney, was sitting on a patio chair laughing heartily as he tried to balance a small paper party hat on his head. The forensic accountants who had helped her untangle Constance's web of deceit were chatting happily by the catering tables. The private security team that now protected her family stood at discreet distances, their posture relaxed but ever vigilant, sharing the joyful atmosphere of the day. Juliet found her children near the center of the lawn. They were sitting on a large quilted blanket surrounded by brightly colored wooden blocks and torn wrapping paper. They were healthy, vibrant, and deeply, deeply loved. They bore her maiden name proudly, a legal and permanent shield against the darkness of their biological father. Juliet sank to her knees on the soft grass, pulling them both into her arms and inhaling the sweet powdery scent of their hair. They giggled, reaching up with tiny sticky hands to touch her face. She looked around the garden, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her victory. She had not merely survived the ultimate betrayal. She had not simply escaped the crushing gravity of a deeply malicious family. She had taken the very weapons they meant to use against her and forged them into an impenetrable fortress for her children. Constance had believed that human beings were commodities that could be bought and sold on the open market. She had walked into a sterile hospital room, radiating blinding arrogance, and tried to purchase Juliet's flesh and blood with a $25 million check. Constance had believed that money was the ultimate absolute power in the universe. Juliet smiled softly, kissing the top of her daughter's head. Constance was wrong. Money was just a tool, and Juliet was the master architect. She had systematically dismantled a multi-billion-dollar empire, using their own insatiable greed as the explosive charge. She had locked Constance in a federal cage and reduced Harrison to a nameless, faceless worker, trapped in the grueling machinery of poverty. She had balanced their toxic ledger down to absolute zero and built a new world entirely free of their poison. The sun shone brightly over the private estate, casting a warm, golden glow over the celebration. Juliet held her children tight, feeling the solid, undeniable heartbeat of the beautiful, unshakable life she had created. The Chicago Empire was hers. The past was permanently buried, and the future was a vast, open horizon, belonging exclusively to her and the family she had fiercely, violently protected. Juliet's journey teaches us a profound truth about toxic family dynamics. You do not owe your loyalty to people who view your humanity as a mere transaction. For too long, society has pushed the narrative that blood relations demand unconditional forgiveness, even when that blood turns poisonous. Juliet proved that the ultimate revenge is not found in screaming matches, desperate pleas, or stooping to the level of your abusers. The most devastating weapon against a narcissist is absolute serene indifference. When faced with individuals who try to buy your compliance or use your vulnerabilities as leverage, fighting back using their rules only feeds their ego. Real power lies in recognizing your own worth and meticulously building an independent life where their influence holds zero currency. Juliet didn't just escape her husband's cowardice and her mother-in-law's blinding arrogance. She weaponized their own greed against them, balancing their toxic emotional and financial ledgers down to absolute zero. Furthermore, this story beautifully redefines the true meaning of family. Family is not a mandatory, unbreakable contract you are forced to sign at birth. It is a consciously chosen circle of trust, built entirely on mutual respect, loyalty, and unwavering support. By stripping away the corrupt legacy of the past and surrounding her children with a genuine community, Juliet built an impenetrable fortress. You always have the right to walk away from the table when respect is no longer being served. Share your own story of resilience in the comments below and let us know how you found the courage to reclaim your power from those who underestimated you. If Juliet's triumph resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories of incredible comebacks, and always remember, your peace is worth protecting at all costs.